I moved to the woods a few years ago. It was something I wanted ever since I started working as a park ranger. Fewer people, more quiet, more nature. When I first walked through the cabin I bought, the scent of pine and damp earth hit me in a good way. The cabin was old but solid, tucked between a stand of pines and oaks. No cell signal, no internet, just a forest and me. At first, I loved it. Mornings were for trails, checking for downed trees, broken signs, animal tracks. Afternoons, I'd take my daughter hiking or walk the boundaries with my niece when she came to visit. The woods were beautiful. Clusters of bluebells in the spring, thick ferns in the summer, crisp leaves in fall. I liked the quiet, except for birdsong or the occasional creek gurgling nearby. I often thought the scariest things here were fallen limbs or loose timbers made slick by mist. Then the bears showed up, huge ones. I knew black bears were around, but I didn't expect specimens the size of small cows. I saw paw prints by the back door, claw marks up trees near the porch, and once I opened the window to see a bear standing on its hind legs, sniffing. I froze. It sniffed my cabin, then ambled off. I never got close enough to shoot a photo. I told myself it was a bear, nothing supernatural, but damn. One afternoon, I was walking a trail with my niece. She's 16, tall with long, tan hair and a steady gaze. We'd hiked before, but this time we took a different loop, a clearing through a stand of young pines. It was wide and bright, no brush, the ground soft with pine needles. Then I heard it, a low rumble, deep and awful. Not like a bear, too controlled, too deliberate. It sounded angry, like it knew we were there and didn't want us. It came from 2 feet behind us. The hairs on my neck sprang upright. My heart made a new beat, fast, pounding. My knee stiffened. We froze so hard I swear I heard my own pulse in my ears. Nothing was there. No rustle, no shape, nothing alive. In that open light, everything was visible. No bear, no cougar, no moose. Nothing, just the hush and the echoes of that growl bouncing between trees. Then my niece yanked my arm and we ran. Branches slapped our backs as we sprinted downhill toward home. At the cabin, I locked the door and pressed my ear against it. All I heard was silence. Finally, my niece whispered, "What was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. We didn't go back for days. I forbade her to come with me after that. Weeks later, my daughter, 9 years old, when she's not growing like crazy, she has her mother's curious eyes, came running in from the kitchen one afternoon. I was at the stove heating soup. Dad, did you call me?" she asked, clutching her bowl. I wiped my hands. "No, honey. What? I heard you. You said, 'Come here,' like 5 times quiet from outside." She looked pale. "I came because you said so." I thought of the cabin's quiet, the trees outside, the air. I remembered that unplaceable growl, not an animal I knew. But I shook my head. "I didn't call you," I said. "I've been in here all afternoon." She went silent, stared at her bowl. I tried to calm her, said maybe it was the wind or the stove or her imagination, but I didn't believe that. Not really, because it wasn't the first time. My neighbor, whose property was 5 miles down the road, drove into the fire lane one evening and nearly wrecked. She said something spooked her so badly she slammed on the brakes mid-turn. She told me, voice shaking, "I see her sometimes. A woman out there, in the woods around my place. She's wearing old clothes, like from way back. A big dress, old-fashioned. I swear she's watching me." My kid saw her too. The little girl, white nightgown, dark hair. She just stands there and stares. Doesn't wave or smile. Doesn't do anything good. I nodded. "When was the last time?" I asked. "2 nights ago," she whispered. I saw them both. Felt them both. Didn't sleep well. I didn't laugh. I didn't say it was crazy. I didn't know what to say. The neighbor's face was lit by porch light, pale, worried. She looked real. Meanwhile, the wildlife near the cabin started acting strange. Deer wandered onto the porch at dawn, staring at me, their eyes too still, like built-in glass. They didn't bolt when I stepped outside. They just watched. A buck appeared one day, standing motionless next to my work truck. I honked and it flinched but didn't run. It just stared until I shut the door and drove off. Flocks of crows started circling overhead, cawing loudly, flocking in odd patterns. Woodpeckers quit their chiming taps. Rabbits vanished. No turkeys. All the kits and fawns I'd tracked disappeared. Under the porch steps, I found a sharp chunk of bark pointing upward. I didn't know which animal would stiffen would like that. All this time, I didn't want to admit I was scared. But I was. I was a seasoned ranger. I'd handled wildlife, injuries, storms, fires. But this, I felt like I walked into something that belonged to someone. Or something else. It got worse the night I decided to sleep inside. The cabin's windows faced the forest, so I left the blinds up. I tried to sleep with the wood stove warm. At 3 a.m., I woke to footsteps. Heavy, on the front porch. A thing brushed the rail. One slow, purposeful step. I felt it even before I heard, like pressure I could taste. Then another step, and freeze. I lay flat under the covers, heart pounding. My breath felt like a drum. It stopped. The night went silent again. Next morning, I found wet footprints in the snow, boot prints my size. I live alone. No one else has the key. The print started near a fallen log, led around to the front steps, and stopped right where the railing was brushed. No second set, no footprints leaving. Nothing else disturbed. Just me and the evidence of someone or something out there. I tried to tell myself, maybe it's a person, someone trespassing, but there's no road near that log. You'd have to bushwhack half a mile through snow and pines. Nobody would or could do that. I called the sheriff. He came out, looked around. He said, tracks, yeah, some prints. Could be a poacher. Check the porch rail. But they're careful. Someone big. He shrugged. Stay safe. Maybe get a camera. He drove off. That night, I set up a trail cam. Pointed at the porch. In the morning, the screen read no signal. I thought, fine, something's wrong with the cam. I tried again. Nothing. Batteries drained. Locked into nothing. At dusk, I was out gathering firewood. Fell a birch tree. Looked around while carrying logs. Smelled pine sap and cold air thick with frost. I nearly dropped the wood. There was a woman standing at the edge of the clearing. Her back was turned. She wore an old-fashioned bonnet and layered skirts, fabrics that must have been dusty 50 years ago. She was very still, perfectly still. She didn't move at all when I brushed a branch and glanced up. Just stood there. Sunlight glimmered off her bonnet strings. Then she was gone. I looked again. No footprints. No trail. Nothing. My instincts screamed at me. This was no neighbor, no neighbor's kid, no poacher. I went inside and locked every door. I put my daughter with my sister. I sent my niece home. I told them not to visit. I didn't tell them why. My neighbor kept calling, worried about the woman. That night, I slept in the truck parked in the driveway with the engine running. No footsteps on the porch. No growl. No footprints. Faint crows overhead. I slept for a little. But when dawn came, I saw her on the edge of the woods again. She didn't move. She didn't turn. Just watched until the sun hit her, then vanished into the trees. No prints. I realized this wasn't supernatural in the sense of magic or ghosts. There were no specters floating. No whispers. No fairy lights. But there was something real, something living or not, that walked into my yard, that called to my daughter, that growled like a wound. Something hiding in plain sight. So I called the Forestry Service. I asked for backup cameras, motion sensors, even patrols at night. They came 2 weeks later, installed cameras, sensors, and a siren light rigged to go off with loud clangs. I stayed at a hotel for 3 nights. Nothing happened. On the 4th night, I returned. A technician stayed with me. We checked cameras. Nothing unusual. All sensors working. You'd think. But at 11 p.m., the siren went off. Loud. Shattering. My technician and I ran outside. The sensor had tripped. The light was on. Rustle in the bushes beyond the porch. 2 people, technician and me, stood frozen. No animal I've seen in the wild moves like that thing we heard next. It came forward slowly, dragging something across leaf litter like a net of sound. Step drag. Step drag. By my headlights I saw nothing I could name. Just a shape. Tall. Gaunt. Clothes thick with dirt. Pant legs clung to legs like they'd walked through mud. Neck stiff. Shoulders tight. It stopped at the porch beam and turned. That's all posture. No features. The hood draped low. I saw it lean forward. That's when the growl came again. Lower this time. angrier, closer to us. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though it was decades ago. I can still feel the sun on my skin and the sharp edge of memory still tactile in my palm. I was 8 or 9, and my mom took me to a reservoir near a national park, somewhere in the early 90s, before cell phones made people feel less tethered to the present. She was up before dawn, gathering willow branches, birch bark, long grass, weaving baskets and bowls out of what the land gave her. I tagged along like a shadow, collecting natural trinkets to help her. Pine cones, broken deer bones, bright leaves, mollusk shells. She paid me a nickel for every piece of litter I found, encouraging me to help the woods stay clean. We parked the old green station wagon near a gravel cut-off path, and Mom unloaded a canvas pack, rope, scissors, bundles of willow, her tools for making things from the wild. She crouched low, inspecting a willow shoot, eyes bright with purpose as I crouched too. Backslash, backslash, there you go, sweetheart, she'd say when I handed her a clean stick or a curl dried leaf. But I wasn't paying attention to anything except the earth under my hands, the hush of wind in the grasses, the feel of sand and stone under small feet. At first glance, I thought it was a glove, lying in the wet sand at the water's edge, pale and limp. I remember picking it up with curiosity, soft material, a thumb, fingers. But when I curled my small hand around it, the texture wasn't cloth. It was rubbery and it moved. I recoiled, heat flushing my face. I realized my fingers were wrapped around someone's left hand, severed just beyond the wrist. The skin was bloated and stained gray-green, fingertips limp. It was horrifying, so silent, so still. In that instant, my scream found its way out without thought. My whole body shook as I squeezed the icy flesh too tight. Mom came running, her hair flying, her face flush with alarm. She saw my hands around that thing in my palm and pried them open. She dropped it gently to the sand. It floated, drifting in the hush of the reservoir, as if watching us. We didn't speak. She lifted me into the wagon, and I sobbed. The gravel crunched under tires as we raced to the nearest gas station, tiny and quiet, with a single pump and a store the size of a closet. She stole a pay phone from the counter, her voice strangled as she dialed. I clutched my arms, ears ringing, reliving the rubbery shock of it all. We waited, the clock overhead ticking louder than it ever did before. Police came, collected me in a dirty uniform, the hand and evidence bags. I remember the bag felt stiff and slippery when they closed it. The cop tried to explain. A teen had fallen overboard from a powerboat. The motor pulled him under, and he'd been in the dark water for a few days before we found the hand. They told me it could have been a bare paw, maybe a chunk of wood, anything but the truth. But I knew what my 8-year-old eyes delivered to me in that moment. I stopped talking for 2 months. Ate, slept, but didn't speak. Every time I passed dead things, roadkill, worms, leaves turning color, I felt sick. I'd inhale sharply, like the air was poison. The smell of decaying life stuck in my skull. I felt like the world was stealing from me, piece by piece. Years later, that moment still finds me sometimes, in the grocery store parking lot or by a roadside creek. I freeze, clenched. I still don't like what I know I will see. 10 years later, I was in my second semester of college in southwestern Colorado. A stressful spring, papers, exams, tension in crowded dorm halls, studying until dawn. I needed space. I needed wild. I packed a sleeping bag, tent, stove, dehydrated food, falling asleep amid rustling juniper and raven cries. I headed out on a 2-night solo trip, aiming for a remote trail along a ridge overlooking pine forests and red rock cliffs. The first day, I hiked miles, the air thinning, my heart steady. I took photos of lichen boulders, inhaled mountain air, felt the ache in my legs as proof of living. I made camp beside a creek that night, built a fire, soaked in the glow of embers while stars trailed overhead. Morning came crisp. I packed up and moved onward toward the upper trail. It snaked through meadows of purple asters and rock cliffs. Around midday, I spotted backpackers ahead. Cheerful voices carried down the trail gap. I didn't feel like joining in. I veered off the main path, pushing into thick woods, pinyon, and juniper closing above me like a roof. Sunlight splintered through. The ground softened. My detour was meant to be short. But after 20 minutes, I realized I was deep in woods, closer to cliffs than the trail, uneven rock and fallen logs. I thought about meandering back, but I heard twig cracks behind me. The distant voices had stopped. I fidgeted. I could feel my heartbeat. I stumbled deeper into pines, trying to avoid them finding me again. That's when I saw it, an altar. It stood in a clearing so small it was like a room in the woods, bordered by trees. In the middle, a flat-top stump about 2.5 feet tall served as a table. On it lay skulls, some deer, some other small mammals. Bones of legs and spines, ribs draped in lichen. Someone had strung thin metal wires or fishing line around saplings and branches, suspending bones, jaws, vertebrae, slender claws, feathers pinned with rusty nails. Bits of copper, metal rings, and coils. It all looked deliberate, ritualistic. I froze, heart pounding. The clearing smelled of damp earth, decaying pine needles, gloomy. My stomach tumbled. I thought, these are not natural remains. Someone had gone through effort to collect, move, arrange them. It felt intimate, personal, chilling. I retraced my steps calmly. My head throbbed. My mind reeled. What kind of person does this? Some private ceremony? A loner with secrets? I'd seen mock funerals of animals in movies. None of this prepared me for raw reality. I hurried back to the trail, then to my car. My sleeping bag, stove, all still there under sleeping pine. I didn't unpack. I got in and locked doors, drove off without turning the radio on. Asphalt met tires, engine drowned. Years passed. I became a park ranger. I joined the Forest Service after college. I remembered that reservoir day, the hand, the altar. I dedicated myself to protecting people in wilderness. I led visitors on trails, taught them how to scout animal tracks, gather seeds respectfully. But sometimes I'd pause. Insects on logs, fallen branches held me frozen. At night, when I close my eyes, I see those bones, the hand in my palm, the skull jaws beneath strings swaying. I dream of splitting logs in camp or limbering up at a reservoir shore. I relive the shock, the smell of rot. Those moments changed me. I still go into forests. I light campfires. I point out deer tracks and pine needles. I guide kids on trails, praise their curiosity. But I'm always listening, always cautious, always aware that beneath the comforting hush of pine and stream, the wild does things neither humane nor innocent. Minding is this: I stay. I stayed with forests through uncertainty and fear. I became a ranger. I don't shy away from dead things like I did then. Instead, I learn how they fit into the cycle of life. I learned to kneel beside the remains of skinned rabbits, dead from winter, pick out a bone to show kids how a skeleton fits together, and explain decay as part of rebirth. I don't go near severed wrists anymore, and I don't collect bones, but I respect them. I stayed so others could stay safe, and learn as I did, that horror doesn't disappear if you run. It becomes learning, respect, responsibility. It becomes reason to stay and care, not cower. And that is how I finally found my place. I've spent most of my life around the woods and trails of that national park a few hours from here. Every year since I was a kid, my family would pack up the truck and head down there for a camping trip. We never did the usual campgrounds. Too noisy, too crowded, and too obvious. Instead, we'd take those old logging roads that spiderweb through the park, places where the pavement ends and the wild starts. We loved finding hidden spots, small clearings, hilltops, places where the forest dropped away into ponds or meadows. When I was 13, we found one of the best spots yet. It was tucked between two large ponds, close enough to hear the frogs at night, but far enough off the beaten path that no one else came by. The logging road to get there was rough. It twisted and dipped past old stumps and broken trees. At the time, we didn't have a vehicle that could handle rough 4WD terrain, so we parked on the last decent patch of road and carried all our gear in by foot. The walk-in was about a mile, maybe more, but it felt like stepping into a different world. As we pushed past the last stretches of road, the forest started reclaiming it. tall weeds, fallen logs, moss covering rocks. The ground was soft and damp in places. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. You could hear the birds and insects, but mostly the frogs. They were everywhere, croaking and calling back and forth in a chorus that filled the evening air. Our campsite was on a small hill between the two ponds, the perfect lookout over the water. We set up the tents quickly, unpacked the gear, and started a fire. The ponds were alive with frogs of all kinds, bullfrogs with their deep croaks, tiny tree frogs blinking on leaves, and everything in between. We sat around the fire telling stories, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the quiet wilderness. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, the frogs' chorus seemed to swell, filling the darkness with their strange, wet music. It was peaceful and strange at the same time, nature's own lullaby. We all settled down early, tired from the hike and the day's excitement. I remember lying on my sleeping pad, listening to the frogs and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Then, around 2 a.m., everything changed. At first, I thought it was a truck on a logging road. But then I realized it wasn't just one. There were two massive black trucks barreling down the old road toward the ponds. They were loud, engines roaring, tires crunching over sticks and rocks. My family and I scrambled awake, confused and irritated. Who the hell was out here at this hour? No one camps this late at night, especially not on roads like these. The truck stopped right past our camp, but instead of turning on lights or acknowledging us, they stayed dark and silent. The drivers and passengers poured out, maybe a dozen or more guys packed into each truck like sardines. They didn't say a word. No flashlights, no greetings. They just marched straight into the ponds. That's when we saw it. Each person carried a long net, the kind used for catching frogs or fish. They waded into the water, stepping carefully over rocks and reeds. The moon was just a sliver behind clouds, so visibility was low, but somehow they moved with purpose and silence. They skimmed their nets along the water surface, scooping up frogs one by one. It was surreal. The whole scene was so quiet, so strange. Not a word was spoken, no laughter, no shouting, just the soft splash of feet in water and the brushing of nets. They worked together like a machine, circling the ponds and scooping up every frog they could find. My family tried to ask what they were doing, but the men ignored us completely, as if we were invisible. No flashlights, no explanations, just silent frog kidnappers. After an hour, they disappeared as quickly as they arrived, trucks roaring back down the road and vanishing into the night. The frogs, once loud and lively, were gone. The ponds were dead silent. We sat around the fire, trying to understand what we'd just seen. The silence in the ponds was eerie. The frogs' voices had been stolen right out of the night. The next morning, we found a single frog limping near the shore, its leg injured and bleeding. We carefully tended to it and released it back into the water. But no matter how long we stayed, the pond stayed quiet, empty and still. We never saw those men or their trucks again. It was like they were ghosts, but no, that's not right. Just people doing something we couldn't explain with a strange cold efficiency. The year after, we went back to the park, but not to that spot. We camped somewhere else, hoping for a more normal trip. Instead, a black bear found our camp. Someone had left a pack of marshmallows open in the beer cooler, and the lid wasn't shut tight. In the middle of the night, we woke up to the sound of crashing and snarls outside. When we looked out, there was a big black bear calmly carrying off the cooler. We froze. The bear walked off like he owned the place, the cooler wobbling in his grip, marshmallows spilling inside, and a few beer cans crushed underfoot. We chased after him in the morning, but the marshmallows were gone, and the cooler was torn apart. Those 2 nights stick with me, the silent frog hunters and the bear thief. The park is beautiful, wild, and full of mysteries. And sometimes the wilderness isn't just about nature. It's about the strange things people do when no one's watching. I spent a week last summer camping in Sequoia National Park, mostly by myself. It was the kind of trip I took to reset, get away from the noise of the world, the calls on my phone, the city lights. My job as a park ranger often kept me busy during the day, but at night, when the park grew quiet, I liked to camp under the stars, alone, listening to the forest breathe. This time, I decided to sleep in the bed of my truck, parked near a quiet area off a rarely used dirt road, surrounded by towering sequoias. The night I'm thinking about started like any other. After setting up my sleeping bag in the truck bed, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed up on a large boulder that sat a few feet away. It was one of those rocks that seemed out of place, weathered and ancient, its surface cracked with tiny crevices and grooves. As I settled in to watch the night sky, the stars spilled out like spilled salt across a black cloth. The Milky Way stretched overhead, clearer than I'd ever seen it outside the park headquarters. That's when I noticed something else on the rock, something I hadn't paid much attention to before. There were shallow bowls carved into the stone, mortar bowls, I realized. Their surfaces were smooth and rounded, worn down by centuries of use. Around the edges, long, narrow grooves ran parallel, likely sharpening crevices where tools or arrowheads were honed. I could picture the people who'd once lived here generations ago, sitting by this very boulder, grinding acorns or sharpening spear tips. The weight of history settled on me then, thick and quiet. I stayed there a while longer, tracing the worn shapes with my fingers, feeling a strange connection to the land beneath me. After a while, the cold began to seep through my clothes, and I climbed down, pulling my sleeping bag around me in the truck bed. The night sounds were alive. The low hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind in the branches, the distant drip of water from leaves. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how different from the ruckus back home. But then came the dream. Or maybe it wasn't just a dream. Not exactly. In the middle of the night, I woke up, or I thought I did. But I wasn't in the truck anymore. Instead, I was lying in a sleeping bag on the forest floor. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth, and pine needles sharp in my nose. Around me, the trees leaned in, shadows blotting out the stars. The quiet was absolute, except for a faint, almost imperceptible sound like something writhing. I turned my head slowly to the left and froze. There, slithering past me, was a writhing mass of black snakes, countless bodies intertwined and moving together like a living river of scales. They slid over roots and moss, over dead leaves and loose soil. Their slick bodies shimmered faintly in the moonlight, each one sleek and shiny, like wet leather. Out of the writhing mass, a rattlesnake suddenly emerged. It was large, its rattles flicking in the air like warning signals. It moved deliberately toward me, head raised, tongue flicking. Then, almost impossibly, it lunged, trying to bite through the thin fabric of my sleeping bag. I kicked at it with my boots, heart pounding, the cold sweat prickling down my back. The snake retreated, weaving back into the dark tangle of its companions, disappearing almost instantly. I blinked, tried to steady my breathing. Then I looked down, where my head was resting. I had been laying on something solid and warm. It was a large black horse, its coat gleaming with a wet shine under the moonlight. But what caught my eye was the horrid sight at its stomach. The horse's belly was sliced open, a wide gash that showed raw muscle and a dark, hollow cavity inside. The snakes were crawling into that open wound, disappearing into the hollow space like they were being swallowed. I wanted to pull away, but my body was frozen. The snakes continued to pour inside, and the horse lay perfectly still, its dark eyes half closed in a way that wasn't peaceful, but something else entirely, like it was trapped in a nightmare of its own. That was when I woke up for real. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it would burst through my chest. I scrambled out of the truck bed, gasping for air, the cool night pressing against my skin. I looked around. No snakes, no horse, just the familiar shapes of my camp and the towering trees beyond. But the image stuck with me. The snakes, the horse, the carved rock. I sat by the fire I'd started earlier, trying to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't like any dream I'd ever had before. In the weeks after, I kept going back to that boulder, studying the carvings. The deeper I looked, the more I realized how much life and history was carved into those ancient stones, tools, grinding bowls. the marks of people who knew this land better than anyone alive now. And I wondered if somehow, deep down, my mind was trying to connect to that past, not through stories or legends, but through something darker, more instinctual. The dream wasn't about ghosts or magic. It was about something real, buried beneath the surface. The pain, the violence, the endless cycle of life and death the land has witnessed. The snakes and the horse weren't symbols or warnings. They were echoes of nature's harsh truths, buried in my subconscious. That night in Sequoia, I didn't just sleep under the stars. I slept on a crossroads where the past brushed against the present, where the spirits weren't ghosts but the raw, living memory of a place older than any of us. And even now, when I'm out there alone in the forest, sometimes I feel the weight of that memory pressing down, a reminder that this land has its own stories, and some of them are as unsettling as any nightmare. We were headed up the east coast of Australia, me and a few mates, to camp in national parks and get as fucked up as humanly possible. We loaded the car like it was a traveling liquor store and a dispensary rolled into one. Cases of beer, bottles of whiskey, bags of weed, and handfuls of magic mushroom caps packed tight into every nook. We had a plan: chase sunsets, light fires, get drunk, get high, and forget the real world. I wasn't driving, so I decided to eat 8 of those mushroom caps before we even crossed the border into the first park. It felt like the right move at the time, to get a head start on the trip, to ride the wave from the get-go. The taste was bitter and earthy, but I didn't care. I shoved them down, thinking it'd be a wild ride. By the time we reached the edge of the park, the sun was already dipping low, a burnt orange bleeding through the tall gums and stringy bark trees. I was already starting to see things that weren't there. The road twisted like a snake ahead, the shadows growing longer. My head was swimming in colors, patterns moving in and out of the corners of my eyes. The trees looked like they breathed, and the dirt crunched underfoot like it was alive. We stopped, pulled the car off a narrow dirt track, and began unloading the gear. I was supposed to help set up the tents, but I was a mess, giggling uncontrollably, dropping poles tangled in ropes. Every time I looked at a tree or a rock, it seemed to morph into some strange shape, and the moss on the ground pulsed like it was breathing. The sun slipped under the horizon just as we got a fire going, the flames licking the dry air and crackling loudly in the sudden silence of the bush. My mates passed around whiskey bottles and rolled giant dubs, the kind that would make you see pink elephants, let alone normal kangaroos. I sank into the camp chair, the world melting in and out like a fever dream. The firelight made long shadows that danced and stretched into the dark forest beyond. I wasn't worried. I was too far gone for fear, just riding the high, laughing and telling myself stories no one else could hear. The night thickened and the stars popped out overhead, bright and sharp, pinpricks in the vast black sky. Around midnight, the drug started to wear off a bit. My body started reminding me it was a physical thing again. Muscles ached, my stomach growled, and my bladder was full. The worst realization was that, in all the excitement and chaos, no one had scouted out a toilet spot before dark. I knew I couldn't hold it any longer. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper, shit tickets as we call them, flicked on my headlamp, and stuck a huge hunting knife between my teeth. No way was I risking a snake or a possum ambush in the dark. The knife was clumsy in my mouth, but it made me feel safer, like a ridiculous warrior on a mission. The river was about 100 meters from our camp. The path was narrow, rocky, and lined with thick underbrush. The headlamp beam bounced wildly, cutting jagged slices through the black. Every time I stopped, I'd see something move in the bushes, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and my heart would leap. I squatted by the riverbank, pants around my ankles, gripping that knife hard. The cool night air bit at my skin, and the smell of damp earth and eucalyptus was thick. The river water bubbled over stones, and the sound should have been calming, but my mind wasn't calm. Everywhere I pointed my headlamp, the shadows twisted into shapes that looked like decaying figures shambling toward me. Broken bodies made of bark and moss, dragging limbs. I was sure they were coming to get me, and I was terrified. I had a shit so bad, but I was hyperventilating, knees shaking. I didn't dare look away from the light. I finished as fast as I could, trying not to let the panic swallow me. The whole time, I kept the knife clamped between my teeth, my only defense against the horrors I saw in the darkness. Back at camp, I stumbled, laughing at myself, and feeling like I just survived a war zone. The night went on in a blur of whiskey, weed, and laughter. We told stories and watched the fire burn down to embers. The next morning, I crawled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and sore, ready to piss and shake off the remnants of the trip. I stepped out, and right there, just 50 meters from our camp, was a public toilet block. It was clean, solid, and fully lit by the morning sun. Aprope Real Badroom. I laughed harder than I have in years at the ridiculous, terrifying shit I'd just taken and the useless, wild scene I'd made of it all for nothing. The night air was cold, but not bitter. I had camped by the riverbank after a long day of surveying. The salmon runs were thick this year, the bears plentiful, and I was tracking their movements for the park's wildlife program. The kind of work that keeps you glued to the rhythms of the forest, the smell of wet earth, the sound of rushing water, and the distant calls of the wild. I had set up my tent carefully, away from the densest berry patches, but close enough to keep an eye on the trail. I knew the bears were around. The whole park was alive with their scent. In the dark, I was suddenly shaken awake by the unmistakable sound of splashing. Water moving against rocks with a steady, heavy force. The river was right there. Could be a bear swimming? My heart shot up. The rustle wasn't far. I froze, the fabric of the tent trembling with the movements outside. The splash got louder, closer. A large bear was swimming upstream, heading right for where I was. I wasn't sure if it was a sow or a big male, but my mind raced through everything I knew about bears. It was early morning, the kind of quiet when the world feels on edge. I held my breath. The water lapped against the shore, the sound of the bear's heavy limbs breaking the calm. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle locked down. I could almost hear the soft pounding of its chest through the thin tent wall. It was close enough to hear its breathing. The bear came ashore just 15 feet from my tent. It sniffed the air, ears twitching. I didn't move, didn't breathe loudly. Then it splashed toward a cluster of rocks, looking for salmon or whatever it could find. The tension in me slowly eased as it drifted away. Later, when I unzipped the tent, the ground was full of huge wet paw prints leading from the river right beside my sleeping bag. The reminder was sharp. Out here, I was not the top predator. The forest was theirs. My heart was still pounding when I packed up, ready to move. A few days later, I was deep into the backcountry, following a freshly cut trail left by a sow and her cub. The trail was unmistakable. Huge paw prints, broken branches, and overturned logs. I was tracking them for my survey, needing to count the number of cubs and watch their behavior without disturbing them too much. The sun was high, and I felt confident moving through the woods. Then I felt it, a soft sniff right behind my shoulder. I froze and slowly turned. There they were, 15 meters away. The sow and her cub, standing quietly, watching me just as closely as I was watching them. Their eyes held a cautious intelligence, full of wildness and something primal. The cub was curious, but stayed close to its mother's side. The sow's body was tense, muscles coiled and ready. I didn't make a sound. I slowly backed away, retracing my steps and keeping my eyes low so as not to threaten them. Every step was careful, deliberate. They didn't follow, but the weight of their presence lingered long after I had left the clearing. Another night, I set up camp near a moose cache I had boated by earlier that day. I had seen fresh boar tracks around the area, but I didn't expect anything too close. The cache was a collection of meat hung high to keep it safe, but the smell was heavy in the air. In the middle of the night, a deep grunt woke me. I unzipped the tent to see a large, wounded boar standing just outside, snuffling the air. It looked angry and desperate. I guessed it had lost the moose cache somehow, or maybe it had been injured fighting for it. I grabbed a flashlight and started to haze it off, banging a pot and yelling in a low, firm voice. The boar turned away and started to leave, lumbering back into the brush. Then it stopped, looked over its shoulder, and slowly turned back again. It did this 3 times, turning toward me, then away, then back, like it was unsure if I was a threat or something it could confront. The tension was thick. I kept making noise until it finally disappeared into the woods. I lay back down, pulse racing. Even though it left, I knew it could return at any moment. The wild didn't follow rules. It moved by hunger and fear and instinct. Weeks later, I was stuck in a small plywood cabin during a willow wah, a sustained 40 miles per hour windstorm that made the whole world outside feel like it was about to rip apart. The cabin was rattling, the thin walls absorbing the blows of pumice stones carried by the wind, slamming into the siding with a grinding force that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I could feel the building shudder with every hit, like it was breathing, alive in the storm. Outside, the trees bowed and snapped under the wind's fury. The cabin creaked, groaned, and at times the sound was so loud it felt like the whole thing might be torn loose. Inside, I just sat, listening, feeling the raw power of the wind. It was one of the most unsettling experiences of the backcountry, being trapped with the howling storm outside and nothing but thin wood between me and the elements. One afternoon, I crossed a glacial river to check on a remote monitoring station. I was carrying a 50-pound pack filled with gear, food, and samples. The river was swollen with meltwater and moving fast, cold as ice. Each step was a test. The rocks under the water were slick with algae, the current strong enough to sweep you off your feet. I balanced every step carefully, using my poles and testing each hold before shifting my weight. I knew one wrong move here meant serious trouble. The thought pressed in on me, but I kept moving, slow and steady, until I reached the other side safe but soaked and exhausted. But the scariest moment came at the end of my last shift, flying out of the park in my single-engine plane. The flight had been smooth until the engine sputtered, the familiar steady hum dropping to an eerie silence. The tank was running dry. My heart jumped as I realized the fuel gauge was on empty. I was somewhere over thick forest, no roads, no open field for miles. The plane lost power. The propeller slowed to a stop. The air was thick with tension as I prepared to glide down. I searched for a landing spot, a clearing, a riverbank, anything. The plane dipped and swayed as I managed the controls, aiming for the safest place. The wind buffeted me from every direction. With shaking hands, I touched down on a narrow patch of gravel along the river's edge. The wheels bounced and skidded but held. The plane slowed and finally stopped. I sat back, breath coming fast, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The adrenaline was overwhelming, but I was alive. I was safe. After climbing out, looking around the dense forest and raging river beside me, I felt a sharp respect for the wild. It didn't give second chances. Out here, every moment could be the last, every decision critical. That flight, that landing, was a reminder of how fragile life in the wild could be. Those nights and days, every close call, every heartbeat in the dark, every breath taken with care, it all taught me something essential about being a ranger. The wilderness is vast, beautiful, and brutal. The bears, the boars, the wind, the river, they don't care about your plans or your fears. They only respond to survival. And so do I. Every morning after those nights, I woke up, packed my gear, and stepped back into the wild, ready to face whatever came next. I was out in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, working on a wetland restoration project. My job was to flag and map wetland boundaries, something I'd done dozens of times before. But this site was different, mostly because of the terrain, the history of the place, and, as I found out the hard way, some things that shouldn't be out in public lands. The spot was a few miles off Route 119, just south of I-81, tucked into a stretch of old forest at the base of a low mountain ridge. This area had once been private farmland, but had been bought up by the state years ago. There was an old reservoir, a wide, flat pond dug out long ago to water cattle or irrigate fields. but it had since turned into part of the wetland system, fed by a complex network of seeps and springs bubbling up from the hillside behind it. My job that day was straightforward. I had to follow those seeps and springs uphill to find where the water was coming from, then mark the boundary of the wetland areas they fed into. I'd been at it for a few hours, hiking through thick brush, climbing over fallen logs, and slipping through muddy patches that made my boots squelch. The day was dry, but the ground was still damp from recent rains. Birds and insects buzzed around, and the air smelled like earth and wet leaves. I'd taken a break near the reservoir before heading up the hill so I could get a better look at the springs. The reservoir itself was quiet and still, with algae floating on the surface and tall grasses growing thick at the edges. It looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew better. Wetlands were tricky, full of surprises hidden beneath the surface. I followed a narrow trail that ran alongside one of the bigger seeps, the water trickling down the hillside in a thin, clear stream. The hillside was steep and rocky in places, covered in thick undergrowth. My boots slipped a few times as I climbed, but I kept pushing forward, making notes on my GPS and flagging tape as I went. As I crested a small rise, I saw something unexpected just ahead. There, in a small clearing between the trees, was what looked like a campsite, or maybe a hideout. Old, rusted furniture was strewn around, a broken chair, a bent metal frame of some kind. Nearby, an old refrigerator lay on its side, the door hanging open like it had been tossed there and forgotten. Scattered around were empty tuna cans, crumpled chewing tobacco tins, and several empty cans of natural light beer, or natty, as I think some people call it. I'd seen spots like this before. People had camped illegally on public land, or homeless folks had taken shelter in the woods. It was frustrating, but not unusual. No one was around now, and the whole thing looked abandoned. I turned to head back down the hill, deciding to report the site to the rangers later. Not my job, but something they needed to know about. Just as I turned, I froze. A large German shepherd stepped out from behind a tree, sleek and well-kept. Its fur was shiny and clean, no dirt or mats like a stray. The dog's ears were up, alert. It looked directly at me and didn't bark or growl, just stared. I swallowed hard. Great, I thought. Now I'm fucked. I had a sturdy shovel in my hand from earlier, and I gripped the handle tight, ready to defend myself if I had to. But the dog didn't move threateningly. Instead, it turned and started walking away, looking back at me as if it wanted me to follow. That didn't make sense. This was a wild area. Why would someone's pet dog be out here all alone? And why would it want me to follow it? Against my better judgment, I followed the dog. It moved at a steady pace, deeper into the woods, past the campsite. The trees thickened, and the light dimmed under the dense canopy. The dog never barked or hesitated. After about 10 minutes, we came to a small clearing. That's when I saw it, and I still don't know how to explain what I felt in that moment. In the center of the clearing, buried neck deep in the dirt, were dozens of old, ragged dolls. 20, maybe 30. They were all grimy and worn, with faded clothes and broken limbs. Their arms were stuck straight up out of the ground, like they were reaching for something. The dirt around them was disturbed, freshly dug in places. And hanging from a thick branch above them, looped around the tree's trunk, was a large deer carcass, or what was left of it. The deer's head drooped forward, its eyes glassy and dull. The body was dried out and rotting, but the way it was positioned looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. I didn't stay long. My skin crawled, and my heart hammered in my chest. The dog just stood there, looking at me expectantly, as if it was waiting for my reaction. I turned around without a word, walking back the way I came, following the dog for a few more minutes until it suddenly disappeared into the brush and was gone. I kept moving, trying not to look back. The sun was starting to dip, shadows growing longer between the trees. I hiked all the way back down to the reservoir, my boots squishing in the mud, and from there made my way out of the woods and back to my truck. The whole time my mind was racing. I had a wedding in less than a month. I wasn't ready for anything like this. The thought of some kind of sacrifice, or worse, something I stumbled into that could end with me as the next victim, shook me to my core. I reported the site to the Forest Service later that week, but they didn't have much to add except a promise to send someone out to check it. I never went back. The woods still hold that image. Dolls buried up to their necks, arms raised, the hanging deer carcass. It's burned into my memory, a reminder that even in the quiet, peaceful places we think we know, there could be darkness hiding just beneath the surface. And that's why I stick to the maps now. Job's done. I've been going back. I've spent most of my life in the woods. It's where I work, where I feel most like myself. I'm a ranger now, but this story happened before that, on private land in western Wisconsin, during deer season. Even though it wasn't in a park or a forest managed by the state, it still qualifies as woods in every sense. Thick stands of maple and oak, hilly draws where the fog lingers well past sunup, and silence so deep some mornings you hear your own blood in your ears. My cousin owns the land, a few hundred acres passed down on his mother's side. It's a hunting tradition in our family. Deer camp starts in early November, and everyone comes out for opening weekend. We've got an old school shack we all pitched in to build back when I was a teenager. Rough sawn pine walls, a wood stove, bunk beds along the back wall, and a nailed up sheet of plywood we use for scheduling board. There's no electricity, no plumbing, just a place to keep warm, drink beer, and talk about the one that got away. Opening morning, it was just me and my dad out there. We got up earlier than usual because we wanted to be on the ridge before legal shooting light. The shack was cold as a crypt, and I remember the sound of the old Coleman lantern hissing while I pulled on my thermals. We marked the map, Hill 3, near the northeast corner, and rolled out on the ATV. Dad drove. I sat behind him, cradling the rifle upright between us. It was dark but not pitch. The moon had been out the night before, so there was enough light to make out the edges of the trail. I could see our breath in the headlamp's beam as we bounced up through the first switchback. It was cold enough to sting the insides of your nose. We parked halfway up the draw and hiked the rest of the way to the stand. The air was dead still. Not even a squirrel rustling. Not a crow. Not a breeze in the branches. That stillness in the woods before the sun breaks. There's nothing quite like it. It feels like the whole world is holding its breath. We waited. I remember the quiet most of all. You get used to that kind of silence when you're in the field a lot. You learn to listen to it. But that morning, the silence felt wrong. Heavy, like it was hiding something. You don't say anything, though. You just sit. You watch. That's how hunting works. 9 o'clock came and went. No movement. Not even a chickadee. That's not unheard of. Sometimes you get skunked. But both of us knew something was off. Still, we decided to break for coffee. There's a little fire ring by the ATV. We'd boil up some water, warm our hands, regroup, and maybe hike to a different spot later. We started back down. Dad led, I followed. I always match his steps when we're moving through deer woods. Old habit. Less noise that way. We moved slow, scanning both sides of the trail. I had my rifle slung, but I kept my hand on the stock. It's not that I was expecting anything. It's just what you do. About halfway down the trail, I heard it. Not loud, not sharp, just something extra. At first I thought I was imagining it, but I stopped and it stopped. I stepped again. There was just a half step behind. Almost like an echo, but not quite. It wasn't in sync with us. Not exactly. Dad didn't seem to notice. He kept moving, head down, hands in his coat pockets. I paused again. Nothing. The trail behind us was empty, but dark in patches where the ridge cast shadows across the trees. I turned in a full circle, scanning the underbrush. Nothing. No movement. No color out of place. I shook it off and kept walking. Then I heard it again. A little louder this time. Footsteps. Matching ours. Just a half second behind. And this time, they weren't mine or my dad's. I turned around again. Slower this time. More deliberate. And that's when I saw it. Up the hill, maybe 30 yards behind us, something ducked behind a tree. It wasn't an animal. I know that much. It was a person. Or at least it looked like a person. But the way it moved, it was fast but not in a normal way. Like it knew exactly how much to show before vanishing. I froze. Every hair on my arm stood up. My body knew something was wrong before my brain did. I kept staring up the hill. The trees were thick, but the leaves had mostly dropped. I should have been able to see more. Then the face came out. Just a face at first. Pale, too pale, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. It leaned out slowly from behind a thick birch, just enough to look down at us. It didn't blink. My chest tightened. I reached out and tapped my dad on the shoulder. He stopped, turned to follow my gaze. We didn't say anything. We didn't have to. We both saw it. We both knew. We turned and walked fast, not running, not making noise, but fast. I kept looking over my shoulder. The face disappeared, then reappeared, closer, then again. Each time, it showed just enough to let us know it was still there. I don't remember the rest of the hike clearly. I just remember the feeling. My whole body was locked up. My skin was crawling. I had my rifle unslung by the time we reached the ATV, but I didn't raise it. I didn't want to provoke whatever it was. We both knew we were being watched. Dad didn't fumble the key. He didn't say anything. Just started the engine and gunned it. We bounced hard down the trail, low-hanging branches whipping past our helmets. I looked back once, just once, and I saw more than the face. I saw its shoulder, and the rest of it. It wasn't right. The proportions were off. Too long in the arms. The joints didn't move right. Its skin looked stretched over bone, but not from hunger. Like it was put together wrong. Like someone built it from memory and got the details wrong. We didn't stop until we reached the shack. But nobody else was there. No Kassin. No other trucks. Just the two of us. We threw our gear in the bed, slammed the tailgate, and drove. Neither of us spoke. We didn't go back that day. I haven't been back since. That was 10 years ago now. I became a ranger a few years later, moved out of Wisconsin, started working in state parks and national forests. I've seen a lot of weird things in the woods. I found the remains of meth labs, camps full of junked-out squatters, bodies of animals that don't get killed by natural means. I've tracked trespassers, gotten caught in freak storms, nearly got pinned by a falling widowmaker. But nothing ever made me feel like that did. My dad still hunts the property. Every year like clockwork. He was up there just this morning, said he got a buck on the same ridge. I asked him if he saw anything. He said no. He always says no. Sometimes I wonder if he really didn't see it, or if he did and just decided never to speak of it again. My dad's a practical man. Doesn't waste time on things that don't help him eat, sleep, or get through the day. That's probably how he deals with it. Pretend it didn't happen. Me? I can't pretend. I think about it too often. It slips into my mind in the dead silence before dawn, when I'm on solo patrol and the fog clings to the pines. When I'm walking a game trail and hear an extra step behind me. When I stop and listen and the woods feel too quiet. It was real. I know that much. There's something in those hills, something that learned how to move like us. Something that learned how to wait. I don't think it was evil. I don't think it wanted to hurt us. But it was there, and it was watching, and it knew we saw it. I tell this story sometimes to new rangers or other hunters when we're sitting around a fire after a long day. I don't give them the details. I just say, asterisk, there are places out there you don't go twice. You'll know when you find one. Asterisk, they laugh, nod, say something about bears or mountain lions or lunatics with rifles. I've seen all those. This was something else. I don't have a name for it. I don't need one. All I know is I listen harder now when I walk in the woods. I pay attention to that extra footstep. I trust my gut. I mark the trail twice. I don't go back to that hill. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll find, but because I'm afraid of what might still be watching. And in all the years since, no one's ever gotten a buck on that ridge bigger than the one we left behind that morning. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see, but I never do, and I don't think I ever will. When I was 10, my parents and my sister, who was 12, headed into Martwain National Forest right at dusk. We hadn't planned much. No campground reservation, no lantern, and certainly no clean start. My stepfather had packed the car once again with a half-finished bottle of whiskey in the cup holder, but nothing to light our night. We pulled off a dusty gravel road, engine echoing through bare trees, and stepped into that hush that only forests know when daylight dies. We had to hurry. My mom and sister unloaded the duffels while I assembled the cheap tent my stepdad tossed aside like it was worthless. I pricked my finger on a corner pole. I remember blood and the sting, but I kept going. The day's last pale light was slipping away fast. Before long, the sky over the pine canopy was a uniform gray, and the shadows under my hands when I zipped the tent floor made the corners look smudged. No lantern. I realized it too late. My mom saw at the same time and tried to keep steady. She's always been the anchor, but she faltered. My stepdad got sloppy drunk quickly, voice thick, breath reeking. He barked, "We've got no fire. Let's just sleep. Get in." His words snapped the tension taut in my chest when I realized we had nothing to do but lie there. We scrambled into the tent. My sister hugged her knees along the nylon wall, her breathing choppy. My mom sat on the air mattress, whispering a short prayer I couldn't catch. My stepdad leaned against the mesh, unzipping a second bottle and drinking. I lay on the ground, heart hammering, watching his silhouette against the brownish-gray seams. Dark swallowed us whole. Then came the first rustle. Leaves stirred just beyond the walls in a tangle of branches. It sounded human, slow, unsteady dragging. The family quieted into the forest. The only sound my stepdad's gulp and the fabric of the tent shifting as night crept down. The footsteps swished again, coming closer, maybe 20 yards away. It felt like an eternity that lasted 2 minutes. My breath felt tighter than the tent zippers. Then a snap, a twig underfoot. Sharp and final. My stepdad cracked in half with a howl that shattered the night, loud and ragged. My mom shrieked too, and out of instinct we all scrambled. No words, just raw panic. I scrambled to my knees, ripping open the zipper, skidding out. The air was as cold and dark as a well. No lantern, no fire. Just my mother's coat hanging half open, and my sister clutching her jacket. My stepdad surged ahead, stumbling toward our silver Honda Civic hatchback parked maybe 50 feet from the tent, beams off but idling soft. I tore across the pine needle ground, branches brushing my arms until I sprinted the rest. My sister caught my hand, but her grip was ice weak. We reached the car. My mom jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling keys, face pale in the dim dash glow. My stepdad barked at us to get in, but he sounded like he didn't know what was happening either. My sister collapsed into the back, flattening herself into the seat, tears streaming. I rifled for a seatbelt, my fingers trembling. My mom forced the engine bright with headlights and screamed up that road toward wherever home was. That tiny Civic rattled under our weight, rust and pine sap shaking against the wheels. I sat frozen, staring out the rear window, dark woods sprinting past. My mom's foot slammed the gas. My stepfather leaned forward, silent. My sister and I sobbed. We didn't stop. We didn't go back. The tent, our gear, the sense of normal camping, all vanished. My mom didn't look at us, eyes fixed straight ahead. The cork in the whiskey bottle rattled against the console. I realized he'd taken it with him. We got home late enough that even my stepdad was quiet, hollow. My mom unpacked, checked us, rubbed our arms. No words, just hush calm, spent. The next morning her eyes met mine in the kitchen. No lectures, just something like apology. We never went back. The tent rotted where it lay. My sister cried once or twice when she saw a forest advertisement or heard someone camping. My stepdad barely stayed in town. He drank elsewhere. My mom quit taking us anywhere that smelled of pine and dirt. I'm 43 now. I still dream about that night. The darkness under the trees, the footsteps brushing through leaves, that one snap. I wake in sweat, heart pounding, lungs heavy with the thought that whatever it was came too close. In those dreams, I'm 10 again, inside the tent. Ears ringing with my stepdad's scream, my mom's shriek, my sister's sobs. I hate camping. I won't set foot in a forest at night. I never will. That night taught me how quickly safety unravels when the light dies, and how close something unknown can come before reason goes silent. The forest stood outside our tent, just beyond the rustling leaves, and in that moment I felt primal fear, the kind you don't forget. My feet still ached to sprint away, arms still burned from the cold of night. And so I stay far from campsites, far from forest roads at dusk, because I remember, darkness doesn't forgive, and some sounds will follow you home, long after you think you've escaped. It was late July when I took that trip to the Amazon. The Brazilian rainforest had always been on my list ever since I was a kid flipping through old National Geographic magazines in the school library. I'd seen photos of massive trees, winding rivers like veins cutting through green skin, and animals that didn't even look real. I finally had a stretch of 2 weeks off work, and a friend of mine was able to hook me up with a small guided expedition that allowed for some solo nights in a base camp if I was comfortable with it. I said yes right away. The camp was deep in the forest, several hours upriver from the nearest small town. It was nothing fancy, just a few tents, a canvas tarp strung up for meals, some gear stored in plastic crates, and a latrine pit dug away from the sleeping area. We had a local guide named Pedro, who knew the forest better than anyone, and there were 2 other people in our group, Daniel and Sophia, a couple from Sao Paulo. I was sharing a tent with Sophia, but we weren't exactly close. She and Daniel mostly kept to themselves, and I preferred it that way. I wanted time to just be quiet in a place that felt untouched. My Portuguese was decent, but not great, so most conversations were short and simple. On the 5th night, we were camped near a small creek, deep enough to fill our water bottles and wash up. The forest around us felt endless, just a wall of green and shadows in every direction. At night, the sound of insects, frogs, birds, and whatever else was out there never really stopped. The moonlight was the only light we had, besides the headlamps and flashlights. It was so dark that if you turned your light off, you could barely see your hand in front of your face. I had gone to bed early that night. I remember because I was exhausted from a hike we'd done earlier. We'd followed a barely visible animal path that Pedro knew, walking for hours under the dense canopy with sweat pouring off us like rain. I fell asleep quickly, only waking up when I felt that familiar, sudden pressure in my bladder that told me I really had to pee. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. I tried to ignore it at first, shifting around in my sleeping bag, hoping it would pass. But after another minute of holding it in and clenching my legs together, I knew I had no choice. If I waited too long, I'd be squirming all night or worse. I'd have to go inside the tent, and I wasn't about to do that to Sophia. So I unzipped the flap as quietly as I could, slipped on my boots without tying them, and stepped outside. The air was thick with humidity, warm even at night. The smell of wet leaves, soil, and decay was everywhere, not in a bad way, just heavy and earthy and wild. I grabbed my small flashlight and held it low. I didn't want to shine it in anyone's face or attract too much attention. The latrine area was off to the left, past the tarp, but I didn't want to wake anyone by rustling around near camp. So I walked a little farther into the forest, maybe 20 or 30 feet, just far enough that I could crouch down without worrying about anyone seeing or hearing me. I found a small clear spot behind some ferns, turned off my light, pulled down my shorts and underwear, and did what all women in the woods do when we've got no toilet. Half squat, hovering just above the ground so you don't touch anything, balancing with your arms and hoping nothing bites your ass. I was in the middle of peeing when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft sound. Leaves crunching, a few twigs snapping, something brushing against the ferns behind me. I froze instantly. I hadn't even finished yet. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My body was still, but my heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was something there. No wind, no falling branches, no rain. This was movement. Slow, heavy, not the quick rustle of a small animal. Not a squirrel or a bird. It was walking. I could hear the weight of it pressing into the forest floor. I was turned halfway, frozen in that awkward half-squat position, still half naked when the sound came closer. It couldn't have been more than 10 feet away from me. I didn't even have my flashlight on. I didn't want to turn it on now. I felt like if I made any noise, if I did anything, it would know exactly where I was. Or worse, it already did. I couldn't tell what it was. A jaguar? A tapir? A person? I'd heard about all 3 being out here. Pedro had warned us that jaguars were rare, but not impossible. They stalk prey silently, he said. You don't hear them before they pounce. But I heard this thing. That made it worse. It was slow, deliberate. I could feel it in my back, like a pressure behind me. Not the sound alone, just that gut feeling, that animal instinct that something alive, something big was way too close. And I couldn't do anything but finish peeing. The second I was done, I yanked my shorts up as fast as I could, didn't even fix my underwear, and bolted. I ran blind. I didn't look behind me. I didn't even turn on the flashlight. I just ran toward where I thought the camp was, crashing through ferns and vines, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. My boots were loose and slapped against my heels. I tripped over a root, caught myself with my hands, scrambled back up, and ran again. I must have looked insane bursting into camp like that, but no one stirred. Everyone else was asleep. The tents were still. The jungle behind me was silent again, like nothing had ever been there. I dove into my tent, zipped it shut, curled into my sleeping bag, and just laid there shaking. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight in my hand, pointed at the zipper, just listening. Nothing followed me back, but I didn't stop shaking until the sun came up. At breakfast, I didn't say anything. I wanted to tell Pedro, but what would I even say? I was peeing in the woods, and something was walking behind me. He asked why I went so far, why I didn't use the latrine. Maybe it was a capybara, maybe it was a jaguar, maybe it was a local, or maybe it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I know what I felt. I know what I heard. The way the forest went quiet. The way the footsteps stopped right behind me. The weight of it. That wasn't in my head. Later that morning, when the others were packing gear for the next hike, I walked back to where I'd been. I found the spot by memory. Same ferns, same slight opening in the underbrush. I walked carefully this time in daylight, and there were tracks. Not clear ones, not like in the movies, but something had pressed into the mud. Big, round, for toes, maybe 5. Could have been a jaguar. Could have been something else. Could have been a barefoot human, honestly. The prints didn't go far. They stopped about where I had been crouched. Then nothing. No drag marks. No prints leading away. I left it alone after that. We moved camp 2 days later, deeper into the jungle. I didn't wander far at night again. If I had to pee, I went as close to the latrine as possible. I didn't care if I woke someone up. I kept my flashlight on. I kept my knife in my boot. I didn't tell anyone until weeks later, when I was back home and someone asked how the Amazon trip had gone. I said it was beautiful, unforgettable, but I skipped the part where I thought I might die in the jungle with my pants down. Even now, I think about it. What if I turned on my flashlight? What if I hadn't run? What if I looked back? I still don't know what it was. A big cat? A person? Something else? Whatever it was, it didn't follow me. It didn't attack me. It didn't leave a mark. But it knew I was there. It came close. Too close. And in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, in the dark, with no one awake and no help nearby. That's all it takes to remind you how small you are. How vulnerable. How real the fear can be. People think the forest is quiet at night. That it sleeps when we do. But I know better now. Out there, everything's watching. Everything's listening. And sometimes it gets close enough to hear you breathe. I never liked sleeping outside. I know that sounds strange coming from someone who spends most of their life in forests now. Sometimes hiking for days, working alone, camping out in backcountry sites without cell service. But when I was 12, I wanted nothing to do with it. Not the bugs, not the bunk beds, not the outhouses, not even the trees. I like my bed, my lamp, the humming of our old box fan, the light from the hallway through my cracked bedroom door. I like being at home. So when my school announced we were going on a week-long camping field trip in 7th grade, I didn't take the news well. Everyone else was excited, cheering, chattering, already talking about who they'd sit with on the bus and how they were going to sneak snacks past the counselors. I remember just feeling cold, sick. I tried telling my parents I didn't want to go, but it was the kind of trip where you'll have fun when you get there was the law, and there wasn't much room for argument. So, 5 hours from home, in some piney place on the side of the mountain I can't even remember the name of now, I sat on a stiff yellow school bus, staring out the window, trying not to cry. The camp was old, like really old. Everything was made out of dark wood, worn smooth in some places, splintered in others. The cabins were long and narrow, lined with rows of wooden bunks. No insulation, just boards and screens and one sad ceiling light. No heaters, no fans, and definitely no comfort. The beds weren't really beds, just rough wooden frames with a sheet of hard foam thrown on top. Some of them had springs, most didn't. Mine felt like it had been dragged out of a barn. The kind of thing you'd use to store hay, not sleep on. The first night was awful. I didn't talk much. I tried to be invisible. We were split into cabins by gender, about 12 of us packed into one room. Most of the girls were loud, giggling and gossiping under their sleeping bags, while our chaperone half slept in the corner. I laid stiff as a board on that cot, arms crossed, eyes open, heart pounding. It was hot, but I was cold. The foam beneath me creaked every time I shifted. The sheets clung to my skin. I hated it. I hated everything about it. I brought a few books with me, mostly horror, the kind of YA pulp that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s. I was obsessed with Christopher Pike at the time. I don't know what it was, maybe the sense that something terrible could happen to someone else. Not me. I always felt safer reading horror than not reading at all. Like the fear had a direction, a boundary. I knew what was coming, and I could close the book anytime I wanted. That night, I gave up trying to sleep somewhere around midnight. Maybe later. I couldn't see the clock. I just remember staring at the roof, counting the seconds between creaks and shifts in the bunk above me. One of the girls had started snoring. Another kept coughing in her sleep. My stomach felt like a fist. I never felt more homesick in my life. Finally, I slipped out from under my blanket, careful not to make a sound. I pulled on my hoodie, grabbed my little flashlight booklight, and picked up my copy of The Wicked Heart. I remember the cover was creased down the middle, and I dog-eared at least half the pages already. I held it to my chest and crept toward the cabin door. The floor groaned under my feet, and I froze, heart hammering, but no one stirred. I turned the handle and eased the door open. Outside, it was cooler, much cooler. The air felt thin and damp, and the smell of pine needles hit me hard, earthy and sharp. The cabins were set in a loop around a kind of clearing, though it was more dirt than grass. Everything was quiet, but not silent. Crickets chirped in the underbrush. Something scurried through leaves near the mess hall. The kind of noise you don't notice until it's all that you hear. I sat down just outside the cabin door on the top step. My legs were cold. The boards felt damp. But I didn't care. I couldn't go back in. That bed was a prison. I turned on my book light and started to read. I'd read the first few chapters already, but I flipped back anyway, letting the rhythm of the words settle me. I lost myself in it for a while, or I thought I did, but something didn't feel right. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't something I could see. It was just a feeling, like being watched. You know how people say that, and it sounds dramatic? But it's real. It's not just paranoia. It's something older. Your skin tightens. The hairs on your arms lift. Your brain starts running a checklist without you telling it to. I don't know how long it had been before I noticed. 5 minutes? 15? But eventually I realized I was glancing up every few seconds, scanning the clearing, the shadows between the cabins, the line where the woods began. My eyes kept going back to one spot, straight ahead, where the gravel path disappeared into a narrow gap in the trees. The trailhead, I think. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just nerves, that I was making it worse by reading scary stories. I shifted my seat, tucked my feet under me, and angled the light closer to the page. But then I moved just a little, just enough to shift the beam of light. That's when I saw them. 2 eyes, glowing, not like headlights or flashlights, but like something alive, catching the beam and throwing it back. Yellow, pale green, round, low to the ground, but not too low. I froze. Everything in me locked up. I didn't even breathe. The light trembled in my hand, and the eyes blinked. It was close. Closer than I first thought. Maybe 15 feet. Maybe 10. I couldn't see the whole thing at first. Just the glint of eyes and the faintest outline of something solid in the dark. But then I saw a paw step forward. Big. Too big for a dog. Way too big. Wide, silent. Then I saw the shoulder, the shape of a body crouched low to the ground. The movement smooth like liquid, muscle under fur. A long tail curled behind it like a question mark. Mountain lion. I'd never seen one before, but I knew what it was. I didn't even think the word at the time. Not really. Just knew it. Not bobcat. Not coyote. Not bear. It was sleek and long and heavy and silent. And it was staring at me. I didn't move. I didn't think I could. I remember thinking very clearly, if you move, you die. But then another thought pushed its way in, something sharper, more familiar. If I get mauled, Dad's gonna kill me for sneaking out. That's what really got me moving. Not logic, not survival instinct, just fear of my dad's disappointment. It sounds ridiculous now, but at 12, that was the loudest voice in my head. I started to reach behind me, slow, shaking so badly my teeth were chattering. I didn't take my eyes off the lion. I could barely see it anymore. The light had fallen to the side when I dropped the book, casting everything in weird shadows, but it didn't move. Just stood there, watching. I felt behind me, fumbling for the door handle, fingers skimming old wood, then metal. When I found it, I twisted and pulled. The door gave way all at once, and I stumbled backward, fell into the cabin, caught myself on my elbow. I slammed the door shut, hard, and sank down against it. My chest was burning. I couldn't breathe right. My whole body was shaking, buzzing like I'd been plugged into an outlet. I sat there in the dark for a while, afraid to move. Eventually, I crawled back into bed. The foam felt even harder than before. I wrapped the sleeping bag tight around me and stared at the underside of the bunk above me, eyes wide, muscles locked. I didn't sleep, not even a minute. I just waited for the sun. In the morning, I didn't say anything. One of the girls asked why the door was unlatched. I said it must have been the wind. Our teacher came by and scolded me for leaving my book outside. It was still lying on the top step, open, pages damp with dew. I just nodded, said sorry. I didn't want to say anything. Not then. And no one got hurt. There was no headline, no animal control, no big dramatic scene. That mountain lion probably turned around and slipped back into the woods as silently as it had come. But I think about it a lot. I think about how close I was, how lucky I got, how that one moment shaped everything that came after. Because something happened to me that night, something I didn't understand until much later. The forest stopped being just trees. The night stopped being just darkness. I started looking differently at the ground, at shadows, at signs. I started knowing things I couldn't explain, like when something was wrong, or watching, or waiting. That night taught me something school couldn't. And maybe that's why I became a ranger. Not for the adventure, not to prove anything, but because the woods don't care if you're scared. And if you're going to be out there, if you're going to step into the dark and stand where the light can't reach, you'd better know how to listen to your gut. Because sometimes the thing watching you doesn't make a sound. Sometimes it just waits. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you live to remember it. I don't scare easy. That's not something I say to sound tough. Just a matter of fact when you spend years hiking, camping, and working in the backcountry across Colorado and Utah. I've been caught in surprise snow squalls at 11,000 feet, cornered by moose in rutting season, and stalked by a mountain lion once outside Moab. I've seen flash floods move boulders the size of refrigerators and lightning split a ponderosa like firewood. You get used to feeling on edge out there. But there's a difference between that kind of fear, natural fear, and the kind I felt that weekend in Poudre Canyon. It was late in the season, late October. That transition window between fall and full-on winter, when you've still got dry days and freezing nights, but the trees have mostly dropped their leaves and the sun doesn't stay long. The Forest Service campgrounds had all closed up, and hunting season had thinned out the casual hikers and families. Just me and my buddy Cal. We were both experienced, both outdoors workers with years of dirt under our nails, and we planned a short 2-day trip just to get out before the snow locked up the higher elevations. We drove out from Fort Collins in my truck, turning off Highway 14 somewhere past Mishawaka. I don't remember the name of the forest road, if it even had a number sign. One of those narrow 2 tracks, barely wide enough to park on, shoulder grown over with cheatgrass and mountain mahogany. There weren't any signs, no markers, no other tire tracks. Exactly what we were looking for. We found a flat spot a little way off the road, maybe a quarter-mile in. It was tucked behind a stand of lodge poles that had thinned out over time, probably from beetle kill. Ground was rocky, but level, with a good mix of pine needles and duff. No water nearby, but weed brought plenty. Elevation was somewhere around 7,500 feet. Crisp air, total silence. But right away, something felt wrong. I've camped in grizzly country. I've slept in canyons where the only flat ground was directly under a rockslide chute. But this place, this spot, it made the hair on my arm stand up. Not for anything obvious, no trash, no signs of other people, but felt off. The sun was low, golden light filtering through the trees, and we just finished setting up camp. That's when Cal found it. It was a blanket, just lying there, maybe 20 feet from our fire ring, half tucked under a low-growing pine. Faded blue, like something from a kid's bed. He poked it with a stick first, then lifted a corner. Inside was the curled-up skeleton of a small animal. Maybe a cat or a dog. Skull still intact. Bits of dried fur clinging to the ribs. It didn't stink, hadn't for a long time, but the whole thing felt personal, deliberate. Someone had wrapped that thing up and laid it there. Not tossed it, placed it. We said nothing, just shared a look and moved on. We both seen worse. You find dead things in the woods all the time, but it set a mood we never shook off. Later that afternoon, we went for a hike. We followed a narrow game trail up one of the nearby ridges, climbing a few hundred feet. The slope was steep but manageable, mostly soft dirt and pine litter. As we crested the top, the trees thinned out to a rocky outcrop where we could look back down at our camp. That's when we spotted something in the trees to the west, a splash of color too bright to be natural. We headed over, cutting across the ridge. Took maybe 15 minutes. What we found was an old, rotted tent, not collapsed on the ground, but bundled up and wedged into the crook of a tree, about head height. It had been there a while. The fabric was stiff and sun-bleached, nylon gone brittle from the seasons. It didn't make any sense. No stakes, no podes, just tied up with cord and shoved into the tree like someone was hiding it. I pulled it out carefully and laid it open. No body. I was almost sure we'd find one. Instead, it was stuffed with notebooks, spiral-bound journals, weather-warped and full of pages swollen from past rains. Some were written in, but I didn't read more than a few lines. Scribbles, thoughts, mostly illegible. One page had a date from 2017. There was also a rolled-up sleeping bag. Moldy, mouse-chewed, no food, no gear, no ID. We left it. Didn't touch anything more than we had to. It felt like snooping through someone's grave. The fire had started to go out in the sky. Those deep oranges and purples that only last 5, maybe 10 minutes. I didn't want to be up there after dark. Neither did Cal. We decided to take a shortcut down the ridge rather than backtrack. A steep side hill drop, covered in dry leaves and loose dirt. We zigzagged carefully, half sliding in some spots. That's when the smell hit us. It came all at once, like stepping into a room where something had died. That thick, sour sweet, rot that makes your throat tighten. The kind of smell that sinks into your clothes. We paused, both looking around. The wind had shifted. That's the only way we could have missed it on the way up. The source was tucked up ahead in a pocket of trees, just off the line we were descending. A small towel, not a blanket this time. A plain white towel, folded over itself, resting at the base of a ponderosa on a 45-degree slope. It didn't look buried, just placed, nestled between some roots like a little shrine. We didn't go closer. Not right then. We hiked back to camp, quiet the whole way. I could feel the unease coiling in my gut. Not fear exactly, at least not the kind you get from wild animals or weather, but the kind that comes from knowing something isn't right. Something human. Back at the fire, we opened the bourbon. We'd brought a small bottle, good stuff, and neither of us were heavy drinkers. But we each took a few long pulls that night. More than usual. Stared into the flames like they could explain something. It was cold. Stars came out hard and bright. A late moon didn't rise until after midnight. We sat there until our eyes burned and the fire burned low. Then we decided to go back up. It sounds stupid now, like some macho bullshit, but we had to see it. We had to know what was in that towel. We brought headlamps, stayed sober enough to keep our footing, and climbed that same steep side hill. Took longer in the dark. The smell was worse this time. Stronger. Closer. We found the towel again, and this time we didn't hesitate. Cal grabbed a long pine branch, nudged a corner open. Something rolled slightly inside like a heavy bundle. We peeled it back slow. It was an owl. A barred owl, maybe very recently dead. Head intact. eyes still cloudy but not gone. Wings tucked in. No blood. No signs of trauma. But it hadn't died there. That much was obvious. Someone had wrapped it up and placed it there, and carried it a long way uphill to do so. It didn't make sense. There were no houses for miles. No camps. No trash. And the way the towel was folded. It was gentle. Respectful, almost. But who does that? Who kills an owl, carries it up a steep slope, off an unmarked road, and places it under a tree? We didn't take it. Didn't move it. Just stared at it for a minute, then climbed back down, slower this time. I kept looking over my shoulder. Not for an animal. For a person. Because that's what made the whole thing worse. Animals die in the woods. It happens all the time. But that blanket with the bones. That tent stuffed in the tree. That owl. None of it was natural. It was all human. We didn't sleep much. Sat by the fire until it was coals, then curled up in our bags with our boots on. The forest was dead quiet. No wind. No insects. No night birds. Not even the creak of branches. Just total stillness. I kept waiting to hear footsteps. I never did. Morning came gray and cold. We didn't talk about it much. Just packed up in silence. No breakfast. No coffee. The ground was frost-hardened, and my breath smoked as I rolled up my tent. We left everything cleaner than we found it. Scattered the fire ring. Brushed out the tracks. Drove, slowed down the forest road. Both of us scanning the woods the whole way out like we expected to see someone watching from the trees. We never did. I've been back to Poudre Canyon since then. Different areas. But I've never tried to find that spot again. Not sure I could even if I wanted to. It's not on any map. Just one of 100 hidden places in the millions of forested acres across the West. But I think about it sometimes. The bones in the blanket. The notebooks in the tree. The owl in the towel. Not one of those things was explainable on its own, and together they formed a pattern I didn't want to understand. I've reported dead bodies in the field before. Found a suicide once. A guy who hanged himself in a stand of aspens. Found people dead of exposure. A flipped ATV in a dry creek bed. Once I found a tent with a dead woman inside, overdose. She'd been out there a week. You learn to look for signs. People don't just disappear without leaving a trail. Someone always left the car somewhere. Someone always knows they were out there. But this wasn't that. This was something else. I don't know who did those things, but I know someone did, and they were careful, intentional, maybe ritualistic, maybe just broken in the head, but deliberate. And what chilled me most wasn't the smell or the owl or the feeling of being watched. It was that it was all hidden in plain sight. Not far off a road, not deep in some canyon, just a few hundred feet up a hill from a random pullout. Makes you wonder how many other little altars are out there. I've seen a lot of strange things working in the woods, but what happened that day off the edge of the national forest near the park boundary was something I still think about. Not because it was supernatural or impossible. No, it was worse than that. It was real, and it reminded me just how little control we really have out there. Back before I became a ranger full-time, I used to camp a lot with my buddy, Brian. We both lived for the woods. We'd spend most of our free weekends deep in the Northern California backcountry, well past the trails people normally used. We had a favorite spot. It was hard to get to, just barely inside the boundary of the national forest, nestled near a pond with a wide clearing around it. You couldn't see it from any trail. You had to park a few miles away at a barely there turnout on an old forest road, hike over a ridge, and then drop down through a stand of thick pines and manzanita to get there. It took effort. That's what made it perfect. We'd been there probably a dozen times. We never saw another soul. No trash, no old fire rings, no boot prints except our own. It felt like ours, even though we knew better. The pond was maybe 100 yards across, ringed with cattails and old mossy logs. The clearing was grassy, flat, and perfect for a tent. Pines ran up on all sides, and a little spring fed into the pond on one end, keeping the water clean and cold. We'd fish, cook, talk, and sit quiet listening to the night sounds. This time, it was early fall. Nights were getting cold, but the days were still warm. We left the city before dawn and made it to the turnout by maybe 8 a.m. We were planning on staying 3 nights, plenty of supplies, bear cans, everything by the book. When we pulled up in the truck, Brian pointed and said, "Holy shit." Right in the pullout, maybe 40 yards ahead of us, were two mountain lions. At first, I thought they were fighting, but after a second, it was obvious what they were doing. The male was on the female's back, biting down on her neck, his back legs tensed. They were mating right there in the open, like we didn't even exist. We stopped the truck. Windows up, engine running. Brian laughed a little, but I was frozen. You don't see the kind of thing very often. Cougars are ghosts out here. You see tracks, scat, maybe eyes at night, but to see two of them like this was unheard of. They were both big, especially the male, probably close to 150 pounds. Muscles under that tawny fur, the way his tail twitched, the quiet intensity of it all. It was like watching something out of time. They finished after maybe 30 seconds. The male stepped off and just sat down in the dirt like a tired old dog. The female moved off a few feet, tail flicking. They didn't seem bothered by us. If anything, they looked bored. We sat there, windows rolled up, engine off now. It was just one of those moments where you feel like you've been let into something secret. After about 10 minutes, both of them suddenly jerked their heads up, ears forward, eyes locked on something in the trees to the north. The male stood. His tail was stiff now, and his whole body was tense like spring. They both turned and ran. Not like they were chasing something. Like they were getting the hell out of there. Straight south, away from the trees. The way animals run when they know something is wrong. Not 5 seconds later, 3 deer burst out from the same direction the lions had been watching. They were flying, white tails high, bounding full speed across the road, maybe 20 yards ahead of us. Behind them was something bigger, faster, darker. A bear. It was huge, easily over 500 pounds. Maybe more. Black fur, almost shaggy, ears laid back. It wasn't lumbering. This bear was sprinting, and it was silent. It didn't roar, didn't make a sound. It was pure muscle and movement. The bear chased the deer across the road and into the brush on the other side. Then it was gone. The woods were quiet again. Brian and I just looked at each other. I remember feeling cold, even though the sun was up. My hands were sweating. Brian said nothing. He didn't need to. We didn't talk about turning around. We didn't even say, "Let's go." We just did. Packed our bags, locked the truck, and started the hike in. It sounds stupid now, writing it down, after seeing a predator chain like that. Mountain lions scared off, deer sprinting, a massive bear in pursuit. Why would we still go in? But I think part of us didn't want to give it up. This was our spot. It felt like we could keep it normal if we just got out there and set up camp like we always did. The hike was quiet, real quiet. Normally there'd be birds, the occasional squirrel or chipmunk. This time, nothing. No bugs. No sounds. Even the wind was still. The trail wasn't really a trail. It was a path we made from memory, crossing fallen logs, ducking under branches. About halfway through, we found fresh bear scat. Still warm. We got to the clearing around 10 a.m. Everything looked the same. Pond glassy. Grass thick and soft. We set up camp fast. Tent up. Food stored. Pack hung from a tree. I kept looking at the tree line. The north side, where that bear had come from, looked darker than usual. Like the shadows were heavier. The day passed slow. We tried to fish, but the pond was dead. Not a single bite. We sat in the shade and ate lunch. No sign of the bear. No sign of anything, really. I remember thinking that the whole area felt empty, like something had cleared it out. That night we cooked dehydrated meals and sat by a little fire. Still no animals. No frogs, no owls, no bats. Brian commented on it once, just a quiet place feels dead, but that was it. We turned in around 10 p.m. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound I didn't recognize. It wasn't close, just on the edge of hearing, like something brushing against branches. Then a long, low sound, like a breath, but deeper. Not quite a growl, just movement. Heavy, slow. I didn't move. I listened. Nothing for a minute. Then a soft crack, like a twig. Not a squirrel or rabbit. Heavier. I waited until sunrise before I unzipped that tent. Outside, everything looked fine. Nothing touched. Food safe. No prints I could see. But I felt it in my gut. Something had been near us in the night. Brian got up, stretched, and didn't say much. We ate cold bars, drank water, and walked around the edge of the pond, checking for signs. Nothing. No prints. No scat. It was like nothing lived there anymore. That second day was more of the same. Dead silence. We tried to joke about it, but neither of us laughed. Something had changed. The woods felt empty. Not peaceful. Deserted. Like the animals knew something we didn't. That night we built the fire bigger. Neither of us said it, but we were nervous. We kept looking at the tree line. The fire popped, cracked, and every time it did, I flinched. Around midnight, we heard something. Heavy. Slow. From the north tree line. No light, no sound, just a presence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. My skin went cold. The hair on my arm stood up. It stopped at the edge of the trees. I saw a shape. Not clear, not distinct. Just darker than the dark around it. Huge. Then it turned and walked away. Back into the trees. No sound again. Just gone. We packed in the dark. Left the tent. Grabbed food, packs, lights. We didn't talk. We hiked out with our lights off, using the moon. The way back took twice as long. We heard again once behind us. Never close. Just there. We got to the truck just before dawn. The 2 lions were gone. Nothing left. No tracks. No sign of the bear. Just an empty pull-out, cold air, and silence. We never went back. 2 months later, I was working with the Forest Service. I mentioned the spot to an older ranger, just in passing. He looked at me long and hard and said, "Place hasn't had game for years. Bears drive everything out when they get too aggressive. Not normal behavior. They start hunting deer like cats. Start tracking. Staying quiet. Not scavenging. Asterisk hunting star. We've had to put down a few like that." That stuck with me. I think what we saw that day was a bear that had crossed a line. Something had changed in it. Maybe no food. Maybe a bad encounter with people. Doesn't matter. It wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It was a predator doing things it wasn't supposed to do. And it scared even the lions. People forget that out here, nature doesn't owe us anything. It doesn't care about our routines, our memories, or our favorite spots. We were lucky. We saw the warning signs. And we left. I've been working as a seasonal ranger at Olympic National Park for a couple seasons by then. Not long enough to call myself a veteran, but long enough to know the back roads better than most. Long enough to understand the silence of the forest, how to read it like a book. And long enough to learn that when the silence changes, when it tightens, you don't ask questions. You just listen. This happened a few years back during the shoulder season. One of those early autumn weeks when summer's grip hasn't quite let go yet and the crowds are mostly gone. The tourists fade with the chill, but the sun can still throw heat like a hammer. I had a few days off and decided to loop around the Olympic Peninsula solo. I like being alone. Solitude out there wasn't just peaceful, it was necessary, like stepping away from static. I had never really explored the Quinault side much. Most visitors hit Hurricane Ridge or Haut-Rain Forest, but Quinault's got its own kind of quiet. A deeper kind. Old-growth giants that have watched centuries pass. I figured I'd explore some less trafficked areas. I had no plan, just followed where the roads took me. There was a turnoff, narrow, not even gravel, just packed dirt where the brush had been driven back enough to let a car through. No sign, no marker. It pulled me in like a hook. I followed it maybe a mile before it dead-ended at a flat clearing, just a few yards from the river. Quinault River is a sight when it catches the sun right, cold, clear, alive. The water looked like glass, pale blue and biting. A busted old footbridge, the kind you stop and stare at before deciding it's not worth the risk, crossed the river nearby. It sagged in the middle, beams split, weathered boards rotting, missing in spots. One good storm, and that thing would collapse into the current. I gave it a wide berth. The place was quiet. Not dead, but close. No voices. No tire tracks but mine. No cell signal. It was hot enough that the air shimmered, even though it was well into October. A strange kind of heat, not summer heat. Stale. Oppressive. Like it wasn't supposed to be there. I parked my car at the edge of the road, nose out, like I always do when I'm in the backcountry alone. I call it my exit plan. Habit drilled into me from field training. Back it in so you don't have to think when things go wrong. The river was too inviting. I didn't have swim gear, not that I'd planned to get wet, but I was sweating through my shirt, and the water was right there. Still and sparkling. Looked clean enough to drink. I decided I'd take a quick dip. Cool off. 5 minutes, maybe 10. There was no path to the water. I had to bushwhack through thick brush and pick my way down a steep embankment choked with sword ferns, salal, and the occasional blackberry cane that reached out to snag skin like it was alive. The slope wasn't steep enough to slide, but just enough to make you pay attention. I dropped my clothes at the bottom, left them in a patch of sun to dry out. I kept my car key on the lanyard around my neck. Another habit, never leave yourself stranded. I slipped into the water in just my bra and underwear. It hit like ice, but felt good. I floated on my back, eyes closed, the sun roasting my face while the current pulled gently in my limbs. There's something holy about wild water. It washes more than skin. But even with the cold, even with the peace, I couldn't relax. I don't mean I was panicking. I mean my nerves started to pick up on things my eyes couldn't see. That feeling of being watched, it isn't sudden. It creeps. Starts as a nudge at the back of your neck. Then your ears start filtering out natural noise, looking for something out of place. And then your breathing shifts because your body decides it's time to pay attention. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been alone too long. Maybe a deer was up on the ridge, or a curious raccoon had caught wind of me. Maybe it was just instinct misfiring. I still don't know how long I floated there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. But eventually, the stillness started to feel like pressure, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I turned around to head out. I walked back toward my clothes, still damp and trailing water. I was already halfway up the embankment when I turned around for one last look at the river. I don't know why, just a gut check. That's when I saw him. Across the river, high up on the opposite bank, standing in the open between two massive cedar trunks. He wasn't moving, just standing there, tall and still like he'd been watching me the whole time. He had long, tangled hair, full of debris, sticks, clumps of moss, pieces of bark. His beard was thick and wild, and his face was dark with dirt or sun or both. His eyes were too far away for me to read, but I could feel them like spotlights. He wore a poncho or cloak made of stitched-together animal pelts. Real fur, not synthetic. It looked old, weathered, like he hadn't taken it off in years. His legs were bare below the knees, crusted with mud, his feet wrapped in something like leather strips or animal hide. We stared at each other. I was frozen. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Then, without warning, he spun and bolted in the direction of the footbridge. That bridge. The moment his body moved, my survival instinct screamed. I didn't think, I acted. I snatched the lanyard from around my neck, clenched the car, key like a blade, and sprinted. Clothes forgotten, shoes tangled in blackberries. Every branch tore my legs and feet. Thorns dragged across my thighs. I was bleeding and running and not looking back. The underbrush fought me. Everything was too slow. My legs weren't fast enough. My hands couldn't shove things aside fast enough. I tripped once, fell into a patch of salal, so thick it felt like a net. Got back up with blood dripping down my shins. My heart was thundering so loud I couldn't hear the forest anymore. When I broke through the last of the brush, I saw him again. He was crossing the bridge fast, faster than he should have been. It groaned under his weight, but held. I had seconds, maybe. I didn't wait to find out how many. I flung myself into the car and slammed the door shut just as he hit the other side. His face was wrong, twisted with rage or madness or something feral. He didn't speak, just screamed. Not words, not even animal sounds. Just raw, guttural noise like something torn loose from a cave. He slammed both fists onto the hood hard enough to rock the car. Then again, I flinched back, fumbled with the ignition, thanked God for push to start, and jammed the gas pedal down. Gravel sprayed out from under the tires as I pulled out in a fishtail that nearly sent me into the brush. He lunged for the door, fingers brushing the handle. I felt the bump of his body against the side as I peeled away. He chased me. I looked in the mirror and saw him, barefoot, sprinting down the road after my car, arms pumping like he could catch it. And for a terrifying moment, I believed he could. He ran full tilt for maybe a mile. Then the trees swallowed him again, and I didn't look back after that. I drove barefoot, bleeding, soaked, and half naked down winding dirt roads until I hit the highway. Pulled into the first gas station I saw and locked myself in the bathroom, crying and shaking, unsure how I'd even made it. I never reported it. I knew I should have. But how do you explain that kind of thing without sounding crazy? I wasn't harmed, technically. I had no license plate, no photo, no name. Just the image of that man burned into my memory. Some part of me even thought maybe I was crazy, that it was heat stroke, or a bad dream. But I knew better. I still know better. I've been through survival training. I've handled evacuations, injuries, lost hikers, and more wildlife encounters than I can count. I've seen people in crisis. But that man wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He didn't want help. He had intent. That's what stays with me. I felt like prey. I still patrol parts of the Olympics, but never that stretch near Quinault. I won't go back there. Not alone. Maybe not ever. People forget that the wild doesn't always mean bears and storms and slipping off cliffs. Sometimes it means the things that choose to live out there. People who have stepped so far out of society that they no longer see others as human. People you won't find on any ranger's map or in any database. People who disappear into the cracks of the wilderness and wait for the wrong person to find them. I was almost that person. I keep that lanyard around my neck every time I'm out, and I never, ever go off trail alone anymore. Because some places don't care how experienced you are. Some places don't want you there. And if you don't listen, you might not come back. That man is probably still out there. Maybe in those woods. Maybe dead. Maybe watching someone else now. But me? I made it out. Barely. And I never forgot what it feels like to be hunted. I've been a park ranger for nearly 8 years now. I know these woods like the back of my hand, and I've walked almost every trail and back road in the park I work at. The job isn't glamorous. Most days it's maintenance, paperwork, checking on campsites, talking to visitors, and watching the forest grow. But every now and then, something happens that sticks with you, something you remember long after you hang up your uniform. One summer evening, I was finishing up a routine patrol on the northern ridge of the park. The day had been dry and hot, with a clear blue sky, no sign of clouds. I checked several campsites, all quiet, some with a few campers packing up for the day. I liked this part of the park because it felt remote but still accessible. The ridge overlooks a deep valley covered in thick forest, and on clear days, you can see the distant mountains beyond. That night, I started my last sweep around 7 p.m. The sun was setting, throwing a golden light through the tall pines and firs. The air smelled of dry pine needles and earth warmed by the day. I was driving my Ranger truck slowly down the narrow dirt road that winds along the ridge. The radio crackled with static, mostly empty, save for a couple of other Rangers calling in their check-ins from other parts of the park. As I moved, I kept my eyes sharp for anything unusual. People camping without permits, fires left unattended, injured animals, or anything out of place. I always felt a sense of calm and respect for this land at sunset, but I also knew how quickly things could change once darkness settled in. After passing the last official campsite on this stretch, the road narrowed even further. Beyond it, the forest thickened, and there were no marked trails for visitors. This part of the park was wild and unmaintained. It wasn't meant for casual hikers or campers. I slowed the truck to a crawl, listening to the soft hum of insects and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The last light was fading fast. Shadows stretched long and dark between the trees. I reached a clearing where the road ended, a small pullout with a broken wooden sign warning visitors not to continue. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The air was cooler now, the scent of damp moss rising from the ground. I pulled my jacket tight and checked my flashlight. Batteries were full. My radio was quiet. I looked around. No one was in sight. Just a forest, thick and still. That's when I first noticed something wasn't quite right. I heard a soft sound coming from the edge of the clearing. A low thump, almost like footsteps, but heavy and slow. It didn't sound human. I froze and listened. The sound stopped. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight beam. Nothing. Just the swaying branches and dark trunks. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying a sharp, cold smell, the kind that often comes before a storm. But the sky was still clear. I started walking toward the trees, following the path where I thought the noise had come from. I want to check if anyone was lost or hurt out here. As I moved deeper into the forest, the tall pines closed in around me, blocking out the last light. The ground was soft with fallen needles and broken branches. My boots made quiet crunching sounds. The thumping noise started again, faint but steady, like a slow heartbeat echoing through the forest. I stopped and tried to pinpoint the direction. It was coming from downhill, off the path, near a small ravine covered in thick brush. I moved carefully, knowing that this part of the forest was steep and rocky. My flashlight cut through the darkness, catching glints of wet leaves and moss-covered stones. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Total silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise itself. I waited. Nothing. Then I caught a faint movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large shifting through the undergrowth. I swung the flashlight beam toward it. For a brief second, I saw the shape of a large animal. A bear, probably a black bear, moving slowly, not running, just stepping through the brush. Relieved, I breathed out slowly. Bears are common here, and usually they avoid people. But they can be dangerous if surprised or threatened. I called softly into my radio. "Control, this is Ranger Matthews. I'm investigating some noises near the North Ravine. Possible bear activity." No answer. Maybe the radio lost signal down here. I took out my bear spray, clipped it to my belt, and moved carefully down the slope, keeping my light steady on the animal. Wasn't showing aggression, just moving away from me. Then, as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The bear was limping badly on its right front paw. It looked like it was injured, maybe caught in a trap or had an old wound. The bear was dragging its paw, trying to keep balance. My training kicked in. Injured animals can be dangerous, especially if scared or in pain. I decided to keep my distance and mark the location. I pulled out my GPS unit and marked the spot, planning to come back with the park's wildlife vet and a trapper the next morning. I backed away slowly, not wanting to spook the bear more than it already was. I moved back up the slope toward the path, keeping my light on the animal until it disappeared deeper into the forest. As I climbed back to the trail, my radio crackled finally. "Ranger Matthews, this is Control. We read you. Over. Copy that, Control. I'm back on the trail now. Injured bear spotted near the ravine. Mark GPS location for follow-up tomorrow. Understood. Return to base when you can. It's getting late." I started walking back toward the truck. The forest felt alive around me. The night sounds, insects, owls, small critters, were louder now that I was moving. I passed under thick branches, brushing against cool leaves. The path was uneven, roots sticking out like tripwires in the dark. That's when I heard it again. A sudden crack, like a heavy branch snapping somewhere to my right, not far off the path. I froze. My heart sped up. I listened hard. Nothing. I took a deep breath and kept moving, flashlight steady ahead. But then I heard more cracks, one after another, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the woods, just out of sight. My mind went through possibilities. Other hikers? No, not likely this far out, and no permits logged for this area. Poachers? Illegal hunters sometimes operate here, but usually they're quieter, hiding. A predator? The bear was injured, but bears usually avoid humans. Could it be a mountain lion? Possible, but they're stealthy, and I'd probably see some sign. I tightened my grip on the bear spray and slowed my pace. The noises kept coming from the woods to my right, moving parallel to me, staying hidden. Every now and then, my light would catch a shadow darting between trees. I stopped and listened closely. The forest was thick here, and the darkness felt heavy. Then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, not quite like any animal I'd heard before. It wasn't a roar or a snarl, just a warning. I knew I wasn't alone out here anymore. I called on my radio again, voice low but steady. "Control, I'm hearing something close, moving through the trees. Not the bear. I'm going to head back to the truck slowly." Static. No answer. The growling came again, closer this time, mixed with the sound of heavy breathing. My skin prickled. I turned sharply toward the sound and flashed my light. For a brief moment, I caught sight of something large and dark moving between the trunks. Too big for a deer, too quick for a bear with an injured leg. Something powerful. I stepped back, try not to panic. I remember my training: stay calm, don't run, make yourself look big, use your bear spray if needed. I pulled the canister from my belt, ready to use it. The thing growled again and broke into a fast run through the trees, crashing branches as it moved. I shined my flashlight directly into the forest and shouted loudly, hoping to scare it off. It stopped, just for a moment, then vanished deeper into the darkness. I didn't wait around to see if it came back. I turned and moved as fast as I could, running the uneven trail back toward the truck. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every sound made me jump: the snapping twigs, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally reached the truck, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The engine roared to life. I didn't care about the noise or running late. I just wanted out of that forest. As I drove back down the ridge road, I kept looking into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, just dark trees blurring past. Back at base, I reported the incident to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded concerned, but said they couldn't send backup out at night. They told me to stay put until morning and that a wildlife team would come first thing to investigate. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the patrol office, reviewing maps and reports, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The park had bears, mountain lions, and all kinds of wildlife, but whatever had followed me that night was different. Bigger, stronger. The next morning, I went back to the ravine with the vet and trapper. We found the injured bear exactly where I'd marked it. It was weak but alive, with a deep cut on it. I was working alone that week, covering the remote northern sector of the park. It was early fall, the nights already dropping into the low 30s, with a stiff wind that cut through even the thickest jacket. My job was simple enough: patrol the backcountry trails, check on campsites, make sure no one was breaking park rules, and report any unusual signs. Most days, it was just me, the trees, the animals, and the endless silence that only the forest can hold. I liked it that way. I liked being out where the noise of civilization couldn't reach me. It made me feel small in a good way, connected to something bigger than myself. That week had been quiet, too quiet. No hikers, no campers, just the occasional sound of a crow or the distant howl of a coyote. The radio crackled now and then, but no one needed anything. The station said there was a cold front moving in, and the forest was preparing for winter. The trees had mostly dropped their leaves. The ground was damp and thick with pine needles and moss. It was beautiful, but also easy to feel alone. I was assigned to the ridge trail that day, a long, narrow path that wound along a rocky outcrop with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest on the other. The trail had seen less traffic over the years, mostly used by hardcore hikers or hunters. The last ranger who worked this area told me stories about how easy it was to get lost here. The landscape was tricky: rocks, dense thickets, and patches of thick fog that settled low in the mornings and evenings. I started my patrol at dawn with my pack full of essentials: water, maps, a first aid kit, and my flashlight. The sun rose through the trees, casting long shadows over the trail. I moved slowly, careful to watch every step. The rocks on the ridge were slick from the dew, and the wind was picking up. I checked the trail markers and cleared any fallen branches blocking the path. No signs of recent visitors, no trash, no disturbances. Just a quiet. By mid-afternoon, the sky had clouded over, and the wind had become colder, sharper. I was halfway along the ridge when I spotted something unusual: a piece of cloth caught on a thorn bush near a bend in the trail. It looked like part of a jacket, faded and torn. I paused and examined it. The fabric was synthetic, a dark green color, and I could see some dirt stains and a few small rips, as if it had been snagged and pulled hard. It wasn't mine, and it didn't look like park property. No other gear was nearby. That made me uneasy. I noted the location and took a picture with my phone, then kept going. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe a lost hiker or hunter had passed through days ago and left it behind. But something didn't sit right. About an hour later, as I rounded a corner near a steep drop, I caught the faint sound of something moving in the brush. It wasn't an animal sound, more like the snap of a twig or the rustle of clothing. My heart beat faster. I stopped and listened, eyes scanning the undergrowth. The forest was quiet again, except for the wind in the trees. Nothing visible. I called into my radio to check in, my voice low. No reply. The signal was weak this far out. I tried again, but all I got was static. The light was fading fast now. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds. I turned on my flashlight and began heading back the way I came. The trail looked different in the dim light, the shadows stretching long and making the rocks look like jagged teeth. As I walked, I kept hearing little sounds, a twig snapping here, a leaf rustling there, but I couldn't see anything. My mind tried to explain it all away. Deer moving off the trail, the wind shifting, but still that feeling of being watched crept up my neck and settled in my gut. Then, just as I reached a narrow section of the trail with a sheer drop on one side, I saw it. Footprints in the soft earth next to the trail. Not animal prints, human. They were fresh, with the edges still sharp and the dirt slightly moist. I followed them with my flashlight beam. The prints led off the trail and down into a steep slope covered in thick brush and small trees. I hesitated. Going off trail was risky, especially here where the terrain dropped steeply and the brush was dense enough to slow you down. But the footprints were close. I could tell someone had been here recently, maybe in trouble. I called my supervisor on the radio again. No answer. I told myself I'd just follow the prints a little ways, see if the person needed help, then turn back before dark. The slope was steep and slippery. I moved carefully, grabbing branches and rocks to steady myself. The footprints disappeared after about 50 yards, and I found myself in a small clearing surrounded by thick fir trees. The clearing looked undisturbed, except for a few broken branches on the ground. Then I saw it. A makeshift campfire circle, stones arranged in a rough ring, some blackened wood and ash inside. Nearby, a battered backpack lay on its side, some of its contents spilled out. An empty water bottle, a crumpled map, some snack wrappers. I knelt and checked the backpack. No identification, but I found a torn piece of paper with faint writing. The words were smudged and hard to read, but I made out the date, 3 days ago, and a few phrases, lost, help, hurt. I felt a knot in my stomach. Someone had been here, maybe lost, maybe injured. I looked around for more signs, footprints, broken branches, anything, but the clearing was silent except for the wind. I decided to follow the ridge back up, hoping to find a trail or some sign of the person. The sun was nearly gone now, and the cold was settling deep into my bones. I switched on my headlamp and started climbing. Halfway up, I heard something, a faint sound, like a weak moan carried by the wind. It was distant but real. I paused, holding my breath. The forest was still again, but the sound came again, softer this time, almost like a plea. I called out, my voice cracking from the cold and fatigue, but no answer. I waited a moment, then moved cautiously toward where I thought the sound had come from. The terrain grew steeper, the ground littered with loose rocks and thick roots. I slipped a couple of times, but kept going, following the faint sounds. Then I saw a figure, slumped against a tree trunk, half hidden in shadows. A man, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a torn jacket and dirty pants. He looked exhausted and hurt, his face pale and dirty, one leg bent at an awkward angle. I dropped my pack and knelt beside him. He was breathing, but barely. His leg was bleeding from a deep cut. I ripped my jacket to make a bandage, trying to stop the bleeding while checking his other injuries. He had no pulse in his wrist, but his heart was beating faintly. I pulled out my radio and called for help, giving the coordinates as best I could. I stayed with him, trying to keep him awake and warm by covering him with my emergency blanket. The wait felt endless. My flashlight was dying, and the temperature kept dropping. I talked to him quietly, telling him to hold on, to stay awake. When the rescue team finally arrived, it was nearly midnight. They moved fast, paramedics with stretchers, ropes to haul him up the steep slope. They told me later that he had been missing for days, injured after slipping off the trail and unable to call for help. Without finding those footprints and the campfire, he might not have survived the night. I stayed with the rescue team until the injured man was loaded into the helicopter, watching the bright spotlight rise into the sky and disappear into the clouds. As I packed up my gear, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The forest was quiet again, the wind soft now, the cold less sharp. I knew the ridge would still be there, unchanged and waiting for the next visitor. But that night, I was reminded that the wilderness could be unforgiving and that sometimes the scariest stories were the real ones, about survival, about being alone, and about finding someone when all hope seemed lost. I took a deep breath and started walking back to the ranger station, ready to write my report and rest. The forest was peaceful now, but I knew I'd never forget that night on the ridge, or the man I found, lost but alive. I started the morning like any other day. The sun was just climbing over the ridge to the east, casting long shadows through the tall pines. The air was cold but fresh, the kind of cold that wakes you up sharp, like you're breathing in pure, clean water instead of just air. I was on foot patrol in a remote section of the park, one of those areas that most visitors never reach, deep in the backcountry where the only sounds are the wind, the birds, and the creek running somewhere out of sight. My name is Dan, and I've been a park ranger for 8 years now. Mostly I work in search and rescue and general patrol. This day, I was assigned to check some of the trailheads and campsites in a heavily wooded area where we'd had a few reports of missing hikers over the last few months. Nothing supernatural about those disappearances, just people who didn't prepare well or got caught out by the weather or the terrain. I've done plenty of backcountry searches, and I know the risks well. Still, nothing prepares you for the kind of quiet dread you get when you realize you're truly alone in the wilderness, and something just isn't right. I left the ranger station at dawn, packing my usual gear: compass, topo maps, radio, a first aid kit, some snacks, water, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The radio signal was spotty out here, so I was mostly on my own. I told the dispatcher I was heading out and planned to check in by noon. The trail was rough and narrow, winding through dense fir trees with thick undergrowth. It was damp from an early morning mist that hung low and refused to burn off. My boots crunched on wet leaves and pine needles as I moved quietly, alert for any sign of people or wildlife. The forest here was old growth, some trees easily a century or more, and the canopy blocked out most of the sky, making it feel darker than it really was. About an hour into the hike, I passed an old campsite. The fire pit was cold and the ground was wet. No fresh footprints or trash, so I figured the campers had left days ago. I made note to check the area carefully on the way back. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the trail grew less distinct. Roots twisted over the path, and moss grew thick on fallen logs. The silence was almost complete except for a distant bird call and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I felt the usual calm that comes from being out in nature, but something was off today. The forest didn't feel welcoming. It felt watchful, like it was holding its breath. I stopped at a fork in the trail where a wooden sign had rotted and fallen. I checked my map and compass, trying to make sense of the route. According to the map, the left path would take me to an overlook with a good view of the valley below. The right trail led toward a small lake where people often camped. I chose the left, wanting to get my bearings and maybe call on my check-in. The radio crackled faintly for a moment, but went dead again. No surprise. The hike to the overlook was slow. The ground sloped steeply, and the path was slippery with mud and wet leaves. I focused on my footing, eyes scanning for signs of trouble. Broken branches, animal tracks, anything unusual. About halfway up, I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the base of a large cedar, there was a small pile of rocks arranged carefully in a circle, like a mini cairn. That wasn't uncommon. Hikers sometimes stacked rocks as markers or for fun. But this circle had something else inside it. An old, weathered boot tied up with a strip of cloth that looked like a torn shirt. The boot was caked in mud and moss, like it had been there for a long time. I knelt down and looked closer. It was a hiking boot, men's size, worn but sturdy. The laces were frayed and knotted crudely. I reached out and touched the boot, cold, damp, heavy with years of decay. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just trash or a lost item. It felt like a marker. Maybe a warning, maybe a memorial. I took out my radio and tried again to call base. Nothing but static. I pocketed the boot carefully. Something told me I needed to remember this spot. I kept going, reaching the overlook as the sun climbed higher. The view was breathtaking. A wide valley stretched out below, covered in thick forest with patches of early wildflowers beginning to bloom. The wind blew gently, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. I sat on a rock, pulling out a sandwich and some water. I scanned the valley for any sign of movement. A hiker, a campfire, anything. Nothing. After about 20 minutes, I packed up and started down the other trail toward the lake. The day was warming now, and the mist had burned off, leaving the air sticky and heavy. The trail to the lake was narrower and less used. I had to push aside branches and climb over fallen trees. Every now and then I thought I heard a rustle in the underbrush, but when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. Just squirrels or birds, probably. Near the lake, the trees opened up to a small clearing with several campsites. Some had fire pits, others just flattened grass. Most looked abandoned, but there were signs that someone had been here recently. Broken twigs, footprints in the mud, a half-empty water bottle. I started walking around, checking for clues. The lake itself was small and murky, the surface smooth like glass. I scanned the shoreline, then followed the faint trail that continued past the lake into denser forest. About 50 yards past the lake, I noticed fresh footprints heading deeper into the woods. They were boot prints, definitely human. They looked fresh, no older than a day or two. My heart started to beat faster. I radioed base again, giving my location and the footprints' direction. No response. I debated whether to follow or turn back. The missing hikers had been reported in this area, so it made sense to track any sign of people. I decided to follow. The footprints led into thick undergrowth, where the trail was almost non-existent. I had to hack through branches and step over logs. The deeper I went, the darker it got under the dense canopy. Then the footprint stopped. No sign of where the person had gone. I looked around, scanning carefully for anything. Broken branches, discarded gear, blood. Nothing. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Something wasn't right. I tried calling out, but the forest swallowed my voice. The silence that followed was heavy, like the trees were listening. I started walking back toward the lake, trying to stay calm. My mind raced, imagining every bad scenario: injury, hypothermia, animal attack. Then I heard it, a low sound, barely more than a whisper, coming from the underbrush behind me. I froze. It wasn't wind or animal noise. It sounded like someone breathing, strained and heavy. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight through the trees. Nothing. The forest was still. I started walking again, faster this time. The sound came again, this time closer, louder. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the shadows. Still nothing. My breath came in short bursts. I checked my watch. Almost 5 p.m. I should be heading back to camp soon. I decided not to waste time investigating the sound further. It could be an animal or the wind playing tricks. I picked up my pace toward the lake. When I got back, the clearing looked different. The water bottle I'd seen earlier was gone, and the footprints I'd followed were gone too. No sign of anything human except my own tracks. I felt a chill. It was like the forest had swallowed someone whole. I called to my location one last time, then started the long hike back to the ranger station. The trail was steep and rough, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew longer and darker. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. At one point, I almost tripped over a log that had appeared where none was before. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the familiar clearing of the trailhead, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I was safe. At the station, I logged everything in the report: the boot, the footprints, the strange noises, and the missing hikers. We organized a proper search party the next day, but no one was ever found. No bodies, no gear, no sign of struggle. The forest had taken them, and that was all we could say. I've been back to that spot many times since. The boot's circle remains where I found it, a silent reminder that in the wilderness, you're never truly alone. But sometimes, you're more alone than you want to be. And the forest, with all its beauty and peace, can be ruthless and unforgiving. I was working the late summer patrol shift in a big national park out west. The kind of park where the forests were thick, the mountains high, and the trails stretched for miles without a soul in sight for hours. My name's Jake, and I'm a park ranger. I've been doing this for a few years now, partly because I love the outdoors, partly because it pays the bills, and partly because it's the only job where I don't have to talk much. The late summer evenings are my favorite time to work. The air cools down just right after a hot day, and the woods settle into a quiet rhythm. This night started out normal. My shift began at 6 in the evening. I packed my patrol bag with the usual: first aid kit, flashlight, radio, extra batteries, my multi-tool, a small pack of trail mix, water, and a map. I always carried the map because no matter how much you think you know a place, the mountains and forests have a way of shifting your bearings. Sometimes the sun hides behind the clouds. Sometimes a fog rolls in fast and thick. I knew these woods well, but I never took them for granted. My first few hours on patrol were routine. I checked the campsite at Upper Elk Meadow, made sure the fire rings were cold, that no one had left trash behind. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky orange and purple, the kind of sky that makes you stop and just watch for a few minutes. The forest smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell you don't find anywhere but deep woods. Birds were quiet now, except for the occasional crow calling from a distant tree. I packed up and headed back down the trail toward the ranger station. I've been planning to take the shortcut trail, the one that cuts through a dense stand of firs and drops you near the river crossing. It's a rough trail, hardly used, and it gets dark fast under the thick canopy. But I liked it. It saved time, and I was feeling confident. I had my headlamp with me, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it for a while. About 20 minutes into that shortcut trail, I noticed something wasn't right. The path, which was usually clearly marked by ribbons tied on branches and small rock cairns, seemed oddly empty. No ribbons, no guidance. It was as if I'd walked onto a completely new route. I stopped and checked my map. I was sure I was on the right trail, but everything looked different. The trees were thicker, the ground wetter. There was a smell in the air, something like smoke mixed with wet pine needles. I pressed on, telling myself I'd find the markers soon. My footsteps were muffled by thick moss, and my breathing sounded louder than usual. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows between the trees started to look deeper, almost like pits. I heard the distant sound of water rushing, probably the river near the crossing, but the trail didn't seem to be leading toward it anymore. Instead, it twisted and turned, heading uphill through a thicket of dead trees. I stopped again. My gut told me to turn back, but my pride as a ranger pushed me forward. I pulled out my radio and tried to call the station, but there was no signal. No surprise. The mountains swallowed the signals like a black hole. I clicked the radio off and stuffed it back into my pack. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light revealed more dead trees, their trunks bleached white and snapped off at odd angles. The ground was soft and wet. Something heavy must have fallen here recently, or maybe a small landslide. Then I heard it, a deep cracking sound like a large branch breaking under weight. I froze. My eyes scanned the trees around me, my heart pounding. The crack came again, closer this time, and then another. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Something large was moving through the woods nearby. I wasn't alone. I reached for my knife, strapped to my belt, and my flashlight in my other hand. I tried to make my breathing slow and quiet. I didn't want to see what was making those sounds. I didn't want to confront it. The sound stopped. The woods went silent again, except for the rush of water far below. I stayed still for a long minute, then turned to walk back the way I'd come. But the trail was gone. The trees looked the same in every direction. I couldn't find a path. I tried my map again, but the terrain didn't match anything I knew. Panic started to creep in. I took out my phone. No signal. I tried again with the radio. Nothing. I was lost. I remember the training from Ranger School. The advice was simple, but not easy. Stay calm, stay put if you can, and try to signal for help during the day. But it was dark now, and I had no idea where help might come from. I decided to keep moving downhill toward the sound of the river. If I could find the river, I could follow it downstream to the main road. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, the headlamp beam barely reaching past a few feet. The forest grew thicker and the ground more uneven. My boots sank into mud in some places, and I slipped a few times on loose rocks. The smell of smoke was stronger now. I looked up and saw thin trails of smoke curling through the trees. Someone else had been here recently. That thought scared me. In the wilderness, smoke often means people, maybe campers, or worse, people lost like me. I called out softly, but my voice disappeared in the heavy silence. After walking for what felt like an hour, I stumbled onto a small clearing. In the middle was a fire pit, cold and empty, but surrounded by fresh footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, large and heavy. I scanned the clearing for signs of whoever was here. No gear, no tents, no food wrappers. Just the footprints leading back into the forest. I debated whether to follow the tracks or keep heading toward the river. Following unknown tracks in the dark was risky, but maybe whoever made them could help me. Before I could decide, a sound stopped me cold, a low growl close by, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, every hair on my neck standing up. The growl turned into a deep snarl. Something was out there, something big. I flicked my flashlight toward the noise and saw eyes reflecting back. Two pairs, glowing yellow in the dark. Bears. I knew the park had black bears, but in this area, some bears had grown large and aggressive. They smelled the fire, probably my pack, and were curious. I backed slowly away, keeping my light on them. They stayed still for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest. My heart was racing. I knew I needed to keep moving. Standing still was not an option. I went back to the direction I thought was downhill, the sound of the river growing louder again. My legs ached, my back ached, but adrenaline kept me moving. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. My foot slipped into a hidden hole covered by leaves and branches. I fell forward, hitting my knee and scraping my palms. Pain shot through my leg, and I swallowed a curse. I tried to stand, but my knee buckled. It was swollen and painful. I realized I might have sprained it. I had to make a decision. I could try to limp through the forest and hope to find help, or stay put and wait until morning. I had little water left, no food, and no way to signal anyone. I chose to keep moving. Using a broken branch for support, I limped toward the river. The trail was impossible to follow. Everything looked the same. I stumbled, cursed, and pressed on. After what felt like hours, the trees finally thinned, and I saw the river's dark water rushing past. I dropped to my knees, grateful for the sound. I followed the bank downstream, hoping to find the main road or a campsite. The night grew colder. My headlamp battery was dying. I heard movement in the trees again, maybe deer, maybe something else. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. My knee was swollen, and the pain was constant. Just as I was about to give up hope, I saw a faint glow ahead, the warm light of a campfire. I approached slowly, calling out softly. A man stepped out of the shadows, holding a lantern. He looked surprised to see me, but didn't ask questions. I explained my situation as best I could. He nodded and helped me to his camp. He had a first aid kit and helped me wrap my knee. We sat by the fire until dawn. When the park rangers arrived the next morning, alerted by his call, I was safe. I have worked as a park ranger in remote wilderness areas for years. The kind of job that demands you be ready for anything: wildlife encounters, lost hikers, sudden storms. It's a job that's equal parts routine and uncertainty, where the familiar landscape can suddenly feel hostile. I've always trusted my training, my instincts, and the gear I carry. But there was one night, late in the fall, when everything I thought I knew was tested in a way I'll never forget. I was stationed at a backcountry ranger post nestled deep in the mountains miles from the nearest town. The post was a small wooden cabin, perched near the top of a ridge overlooking thick forests and rocky valleys. This was the kind of place where cell phones rarely worked, and you had to depend on your radio for communication. The nearest backup ranger was over an hour's hike away, and by road, even longer. The season was changing. The days had grown short, and the nights were cold and sharp. A few days earlier, a light dusting of snow had covered the ground, but the forecast predicted clear skies. Still, the temperature was dropping fast after dark. I was on a solo night shift, meaning I would spend the night alone at the cabin, keeping watch and ready to respond if anything came up. By 6 p.m., I had finished my rounds. I checked the trails leading up to the cabin, inspected the signage, and scanned the forest with my binoculars. No signs of recent hikers or wildlife close by. The wind was calm, and the sky was beginning to darken with stars. It was the kind of clear, crisp night you dream about when you want quiet. But there was an odd stillness that felt heavier than usual, as if the forest was holding its breath. The cabin's small wood stove kept the room warm. I had a stack of logs on the side and a thermos of strong black coffee. The radio crackled occasionally with faint chatter from rangers elsewhere in the park, mostly routine check-ins. I settled into my chair by the window, eyes on the forest just beyond the porch light. The trees stood black and silent in the moonlight. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something moving near the edge of the tree line below the ridge. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a coyote. The movement was low and slow, almost like it was stalking something. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam swept across the dark undergrowth, catching nothing but shadows. That's when I heard it, a sharp, cracking noise from the forest behind the cabin. It wasn't the usual sounds of branches swaying in the wind or small animals scrambling through leaves. This was deliberate, slow, heavy footsteps, not close, but definitely nearby. I turned on a radio and keyed the mic, reporting my location and the strange noise. No immediate response, just static. The radio seemed to be cutting out. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and slowly moved around the cabin to check the perimeter. The beam of light fell on broken branches and flattened grass, evidence of something large moving through the woods. My mind went to bears or mountain lions, common in the area, but the footsteps were too heavy and too slow to be either. Bears tend to move quickly, or at least with a pattern that's easier to read. This was different, more calculated. I checked my pistol, a last resort measure I didn't like using but was trained for. I also grabbed my knife and a can of bear spray. I stayed near the porch, shining my light in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse. The forest was quiet again, but the feeling that I was being watched didn't leave. The hairs on my neck prickled. I tried to stay calm and rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a hunter, but it was outside the season and the park had strict rules. Maybe a poacher or a trespasser. Then the radio suddenly burst with static, louder than before, and a strange faint tapping noise began over the speaker. It sounded like someone banging on a tree, but distorted, like the signal was breaking up. I keyed the mic again, trying to call for help. No reply. The radio was failing, and I realized I was alone with whatever was out there. Around 10 p.m., the temperature dropped sharply. The porch light flickered once, then went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, except for the stars and my flashlight beam. I stepped inside and locked the door, feeling more vulnerable than ever. I checked the windows. The forest looked empty, but shadows moved just beyond the glass, shifting as if someone or something was pacing the edge of the clearing. The tapping noise returned, this time from outside the cabin walls. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Not natural. It was unnerving, like a message or a warning. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door crack to peer outside. The moonlight revealed a faint trail of footprints in the soft dirt, leading away from the cabin and back into the forest. The prints were large, much bigger than a bear's, and oddly human in shape. But the stride was too long, and the spacing uneven, as if the creature was limping or dragging one leg. I took out my notebook and sketched the footprints as best I could. My training told me to collect as much evidence as possible if I encountered a poacher or a legal hunter. The tapping stopped. The forest was silent again. I decided I couldn't wait passively. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, though it was spotty, pistol, and bear spray, and set out to follow the trail. The air was sharp and cold, each breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. I moved carefully down the ridge, stepping lightly over roots and rocks. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and fallen leaves. As I moved deeper, I noticed broken branches snapped at unnatural angles and patches of disturbed soil. Something large had passed through recently. After 20 minutes, the trail led to a small clearing where the earth looked scraped and dug up. There were makeshift shelters built from branches and tarps, abandoned and torn. I scanned the area for signs of whoever had been here. The place looked hastily abandoned. Nearby, a partially burned campfire still had smoldering embers, suggesting someone had been there only hours before. That's when I heard the faint sound of something moving just beyond the clearing. Leaves rustling, soft thumps. I froze, heart pounding. I wasn't alone out here. The radio crackled briefly in my pocket, then cut out again. No signal. I decided to retreat slowly back to the cabin, making noise on purpose this time, clearing my throat, tapping on trees, to let whoever was out here know I was armed and aware. The forest seemed to close in tighter as I made my way up the ridge. The feeling of eyes watching didn't fade. Every shadow could hide something. When I reached the cabin, I double-locked the door and secured the windows with extra latches. I checked the radio again. Dead. I sat by the stove, listening to the wind shift outside. The tapping noise came back, this time directly against the cabin's outer wall. I stood and shone my flashlight through the window. Nothing visible. The tapping stopped. I spent the rest of the night listening. When dawn finally broke, the forest lightened and the tapping ceased completely. I packed up and hiked down the ridge to the ranger station where I reported what I'd seen. After a search team was sent to the abandoned camp, they found evidence of a man living illegally in the woods, someone with a history of violent behavior and evading law enforcement. He'd apparently been hiding here, moving cautiously, but had disappeared overnight, possibly because he realized the ranger station knew about him. The experience left me shaken, but more aware of the realities of wilderness law enforcement. Sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but people, the ones who use the forest to hide and do harm. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that night. That was the thing about working as a park ranger in a place like this. Most days blended together a long stretch of routine checks, trail patrols, fixing signage, answering the occasional visitor question. The forest was big and wild, sure, but mostly quiet in a way that just felt normal after a while. You get used to it. I started my evening shift just before dusk. The sky was bruised with purple clouds, the last heat of the day slipping away under the tall pines and firs. The trail I had to cover was a narrow dirt path winding through a thick patch of old-growth forest. Ancient trees, fallen logs covered in moss, and underbrush so dense you had to watch your footing. I was alone, like usual. No cell signal this deep in the woods, which meant no easy calls for backup. My radio crackled faintly with the distant sound of the ranger station. But beyond that, the only real sounds were the wind moving through the needles and the slow rhythm of my boots on the dirt. The air smelled sharp, wet earth, pine sap, and something else I couldn't place. I stopped a few times to check the condition of the trail, marking spots where erosion had started to carve small gullies. I snapped photos with my phone to send back to the maintenance crew tomorrow. The forest was alive in its own slow, patient way, and I tried to respect it. As night fell, my flashlight cut through the growing dark, the beam bouncing off leaves and branches. I kept an eye on the ground too, because this stretch was known for mountain lions, especially when the deer moved down from the higher meadows. I had my usual gear, bear spray clipped to my belt, a hunting knife strapped to my thigh, and my rifle in the pack just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but it was a wilderness rule. Be prepared and keep your head clear. At some point, I realized the usual wildlife sounds were thinning out. No distant hoot of an owl, no rustle of small critters. The forest felt quieter than normal, like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a low snapping sound, like a heavy branch breaking somewhere off the trail. My heart picked up. I stopped and listened hard. Nothing else. I moved cautiously toward where I thought the sound came from. Slow steps, flashlights sweeping side to side. The trees were thick there, and the underbrush was dense with ferns and blackberry bushes. I couldn't see much, but I caught a glimpse of something moving fast between the trunks. My first thought was a deer, or maybe a bear, but the way it moved was different, too quick, too purposeful. I called out softly, "Hey," but my voice felt strange in the silence. No answer, nothing. I checked the area carefully, scanning with my light, but found no sign of the animal. No tracks, no broken branches. Just the disturbed leaves on the ground where the noise came from. That's when the feeling really started. The one I don't think you can explain well unless you've been deep in the woods alone and suddenly felt like you're not alone. I turned back to the trail and kept walking, faster this time. My flashlight's beam bounced off a weird patch on the ground. I knelt down and shined my light on it. Fresh footprints. Not deer or bear prints, but human. Only these prints didn't look right. They were muddied and big, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and the stride was strange, like whoever made them wasn't walking naturally. I stared at the prints for a long minute, my mind racing. Then I heard it again, the snap of a branch, this time closer, right behind me. I whipped around and pointed the flashlight. The beam caught a figure, tall, wide-shouldered, but mostly hidden behind the trees. For a second, I thought it was a person, but the shape didn't move like a human. The shoulders hunched oddly, and the head tilted in a way that made me sick in my stomach. I backed away slowly, reaching for my bear spray. The figure didn't follow, but watched from the shadows. That's when my radio crackled. A voice from the station, faint but clear. "Ranger, you copy? We got reports of hikers missing near your location. You okay?" I swallowed hard and replied, voice steady, "Copy that. I'm fine, but I'm investigating something strange out here. Not sure what it is yet." I turned and started walking briskly back toward the main trailhead. The figure stayed put, watching. By the time I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, the night was thick and cold. I locked the doors, radioed to my location, and stayed inside, heart pounding. The next morning, a search team came through. They found no sign of the figure, but they did find the missing hiker's campsite abandoned, tents torn open, supplies scattered. No footprints besides the strange ones I saw. They called it a bear attack, but I know what I saw that night wasn't a bear. Sometimes in the deep woods, you realize the forest has things you can't explain, things that don't belong. I'm still out here, still watching. Because if you don't, who will? I was working a solo night shift in the park, the kind that every ranger hates, but someone's got to do. The park was one of those big, wild places with dense forests and long stretches of unlit roads that disappear into the trees. My job was simple: patrol the back roads, check the campsites, keep an eye out for any trouble, and radio and updates every hour. I started the shift just before sunset. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange. The air had that sharp, cool smell you get just before dark, mixed with the heavy scent of pine and damp earth. I drove slowly down the gravel road, the truck's headlights cutting through the growing shadows. The radio crackled softly beside me. I'd done this route dozens of times, but something about night shifts always felt different. The forest looked deeper, almost endless, and sounds that barely registered during the day seemed louder. The crack of a branch, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. It's easy to convince yourself that the forest is watching. Around 9:30 p.m., I stopped at the first campsite to check on the campers. Most of the sites were empty this late in the season, but a few had tents or RVs parked. The one I stopped at was empty, no sign of people. The fire pit was cold, the ground covered with dead leaves. I did a quick walk around, checking for signs of trouble or anything left behind. Nothing. I made a note on my pad and got back in the truck. The roads were narrow, twisting in and out of thick forest. At some points, the trees were so close I could reach out and touch their bark from the window. The silence between the occasional bird calls and wind rustling through the leaves was heavy. I felt it pressing against my skin, making me hyper-aware of every little sound. As I drove deeper into the park, the road started to climb. The forest grew denser and darker. The headlights bounced off twisted roots and low branches hanging over the road. The smell shifted too. The pine gave way to a damp, mossy scent, like the earth had soaked in the night's cold and wouldn't let go. I was about halfway through the route when I heard it. A sharp, sudden noise coming from the woods on my right. It was a loud crack, like a big branch snapping under weight, followed by a rustling. My first thought was an animal, probably a deer or a bear moving through the brush. But there was something else, something different about the sound. It was too deliberate, too close. I slowed the truck to a crawl, peering out into the darkness beyond the road. The forest was thick, almost black except for the yellow beam of my headlights. I caught a glimpse of movement, something large and fast, slipping between the trees, just out of clear view. My heart picked up pace. I pulled over to the side, cutting the engine and sitting still for a moment. The night was quiet again, but the silence felt strange, like it was waiting. My radio was dead silent. No other rangers around. Just me and the dark forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air was colder now, biting against my face. I shined the beam into the woods where I'd seen movement. The trees cast long, jagged shadows. The forest floor was uneven, covered in dead leaves, sticks, and rocks. My boots crunched softly on the gravel beside the road. I scanned left and right, the flashlight cutting through the blackness. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, mixed with the sharp tang of pine needles and moss. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere nearby, maybe a small creek hidden under the undergrowth. I stepped off the road and into the trees, moving carefully. The ground was soft and uneven. Every step kicked up the scent of damp dirt. I kept my flashlight low, looking for anything out of place, broken branches, footprints, anything that might explain the noise. About 20 feet in, I saw it, a big, deep footprint pressed into the soft earth. It wasn't a deer or a bear print. It was too large and had a shape that looked like a heavy boot. Someone had been here recently. My heart pounded louder now. It wasn't just an animal. I looked around, trying to see if there were more prints. I found a trail, a path of heavy boot prints leading deeper into the woods, crossing under trees and over roots. Whoever had been moving through here, maybe hiding or just walking slowly. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was alone, deep in the park at night, and someone was out here with me. I had a choice: follow the prints and see where they led, or get back to the truck and call it in. I grabbed my radio and hit the button, but the only response was static. The forest blocked the signal. If someone was out here, I couldn't call for backup. I decided to follow the trail, keeping the flashlight close to the ground to watch my step. The prints led downhill towards a small creek that wasn't on my map. The sound of running water grew louder, mixing with the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As I got closer to the creek, the trail stopped. The prints faded into the mud near the water's edge. It looked like whoever made them had crossed here and disappeared into the other side of the forest. I crouched down to look closer. The mud was wet and sticky. I saw something half buried, a crumpled piece of paper or cloth. I grabbed it carefully with my gloved hand. It was a torn piece of a map, old and faded, with some markings drawn in black ink. The markings looked like a crude trail leading to a spot deep in the forest, somewhere off any official path. It made no sense why someone would be here at night, with no clear reason. Suddenly, I heard another noise, a distant snap from the other side of the creek, like someone stepping on a branch. I froze, holding my breath. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath too. I tried calling out quietly, but my voice sounded small and weak against the wide, dark woods. No answer. I knew then I was being watched, maybe followed. I didn't want to panic, but my mind raced with all the possibilities. Could be a lost hiker, someone running from the law, or worse, someone who didn't want to be found. I turned back toward the truck, moving carefully but quickly. The forest seemed different now, darker, heavier. Every shadow looked like it moved just before I saw it. When I got back to the road, I saw my truck's headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The truck was parked crooked, half in the ditch. Someone had been here, or tried to use it. I checked inside. Nothing was stolen, no sign of forced entry. But the radio was smashed, its antenna bent and twisted. Someone had deliberately cut off my contact with the outside world. My heart sank. I was truly alone. I sat inside for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. The night felt endless. I thought about calling dispatch on my cell phone, but the signal was weak, barely 1 bar. If I drove back toward the main road, I could probably get a better signal, but that meant moving through the dark forest roads, possibly with whoever had been following me still out there. I decided to stay put until dawn. The forest was dangerous at night, and I wasn't sure what or who was out there. The hours crawled by. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds outside. A distant coyote's howl, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. Every noise put me on edge. Around 4 a.m., just before first light, I heard something moving nearby. Not an animal, heavier, slower steps. Someone was walking along the road, approaching the truck. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy baton from the console, ready to defend myself. The footsteps stopped just outside the beam of my light. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out, voice firm and loud. "Park Ranger, identify yourself." No answer. The footsteps started to move away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't follow. I waited until the sky started to lighten. When the first pale light hit the treetops, I started the truck and slowly drove back to the main ranger station. On the way back, I called in the whole story, describing the footprints, the smashed radio, and the strange noises. Backup arrived quickly and searched the area. They found signs that someone had been camping illegally and moving through the forest, old fire rings, trash, and footprints matching the ones I'd seen. They never found anyone that night. The park was quiet again after that. But for weeks, I kept checking the back roads with another ranger. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. That night taught me how lonely and wild the forest really is, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. The real danger isn't from the forest itself, but from the unknown humans who wander it, hidden in the dark, with no one to see what they do. I keep my radio and truck in good shape now, always ready for the worst. But sometimes, when the night is still and the woods grow silent, I still think about those footsteps just beyond the light. And I know that in the wild, it's not just nature you have to watch for, it's people too. I'm a park ranger. I work in a big, wild national forest with deep woods, steep hills, and rivers running clear but fast. I've been on the job for years now, and I know the trails and the land like the back of my hand. I'm used to quiet out here, the sounds of the wind through pine needles, birds, and sometimes the far-off howl of a coyote. Most days are peaceful, but once in a while, something happens that shakes you up. This story comes from one of those days. It was late September, and the weather was just starting to turn cold. The leaves were mostly still green, but tinged with red and yellow along the edges. The smell of damp earth and fallen leaves filled the air. I had just finished checking some remote trails far from the main campground. It was late afternoon when I decided to take a shortcut back through a seldom used path called Old Creek Trail. It was narrow, mostly overgrown, and hadn't seen much traffic in years. A few years ago, a big storm washed out a bridge, and since then, hardly anyone went that way. I liked it though. The forest was thicker there, darker under the tall trees. The creek ran alongside the trail, sometimes loud and clear, sometimes just a trickle. Moss grew thick on the rocks, and the air was cooler than the rest of the park. I had a feeling I'd be done with my day's work soon and could get back to the ranger station for some rest. I didn't expect anything unusual, just the usual slow walk back, boots crunching leaves, eyes watching for deer or a bird flash. But things didn't go like that. Early on, the trail was clear enough. I kept an eye out for signs of wildlife, fallen branches, or anything that might have been left behind. After about 20 minutes, the trail narrowed so much that the bushes brushed my arms as I walked. The ground was uneven, with rocks and roots sticking out, and the air grew cooler, heavier. I was about halfway down the trail when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft mud near the creek, deep and wide, definitely not human. The size told me they belonged to a large animal, maybe a bear, but the pattern didn't match anything I'd seen before. The prints were spaced too far apart, almost like the animal had a strange way of walking. I stopped and looked closer. The prints ran alongside the trail for a bit, then veered off into the woods. I could see broken branches and crushed brush in that direction. That's when I felt it, a sudden stillness. The usual forest sounds disappeared. No birds chirping, no rustle of squirrels or chipmunks. Even the creek seemed quieter. I pulled out my radio to check in with the station, but the signal was weak. This part of the forest was notorious for poor reception. I tried again, but only static answered. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest being quiet. Sometimes animals went still to listen for danger. I kept moving, careful now, boots stepping slower, eyes scanning the shadows. After another 10 minutes, I heard a sound behind me. At first, it was just a faint crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stopped and listened. The sound didn't come again, so I shrugged it off. The woods play tricks on you, I thought. But then it happened again. Crunch, crunch. This time closer, steady, following my steps. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know what was there. I walked faster, heart beating hard, boots pounding the ground. The trail twisted and rose up a small hill. At the top, the trees opened a little, letting in more light. I stopped to catch my breath and looked back. Nothing. No person. No animal. I kept going. Suddenly, I heard a sharp snap to my left near the creek. I spun around and aimed my flashlight, but the beam only lit up the trees and shadows. Nothing moved. I pulled out my emergency whistle and gave 3 loud blasts. Usually, that's enough to scare off any wild animal or alert another ranger if needed. But no response. Silence. The feeling of being watched settled deep in my chest. Not the kind of watching from a curious deer or a bird, but something colder, heavier. I swallowed hard, tightened my jacket, and kept moving. The trail grew narrower and the underbrush thicker. My flashlight barely cut through the dark green walls of leaves and branches. The creek was louder here, rushing over rocks and fallen logs. I heard water splash and thought maybe a deer or elk had jumped in. I turned the light toward the sound but saw nothing. Then just as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A figure stood by the creek. Not a person. Too big and bulky for that. It was covered in dark fur, its shape hunched but tall. I froze, breath caught. The figure didn't move, but watched me. Its eyes caught the light and glinted bright yellow. My first thought was bear, but this was different, taller, broader, and the way it stood was strange, almost upright like a man. I've heard rumors from other rangers and hunters about big animals walking on 2 legs deep in the woods. Some called them wild men or Bigfoot. I didn't believe those stories. I always figured it was just bears or large elk seen from the wrong angle. Now, seeing this, I wasn't so sure. The figure didn't come closer, didn't run. It just stood there, eyes fixed on me. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. I slowly backed away, watching it carefully. As I turned to leave, I slipped on a wet rock and fell hard on my side. My flashlight tumbled out of my hand, rolling into the bushes. Darkness closed around me. Panic hit. I scrambled to find the flashlight, but couldn't see a thing. I heard heavy breathing behind me and twigs snapping closer. I forced myself to stay calm, crawling to where I thought the light had fallen. My fingers brushed the flashlight and I grabbed it, flicking it back on. The beam caught the figure again. It had moved closer, maybe only 10 feet away now. Its breath came out in heavy huffs, misting in the cold air. I stood up slowly, trying not to make sudden moves. The figure started to retreat, slipping back into the woods without breaking eye contact. I didn't wait to see where it went. I ran. The trail was uneven and steep here, and I stumbled more than once, but I kept running. Behind me, the forest returned to its usual quiet, but I didn't look back until it was clear of the thick trees and back near the main path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, panting, hands shaking. I reported what I saw over the radio. A few other rangers didn't believe me, but some told me they'd heard strange noises in that area before. No one had ever caught anything on camera or found clear proof. Over the next days, I stayed away from that part of the forest. But the footprints, the figure, the way it moved stayed with me. I checked the trail again, finding the footprints still fresh near the creek. They disappeared suddenly, as if whatever made them melted back into the forest. In the end, I never found out what that thing was. No cameras caught it, no one else saw it, and the park log stayed quiet. But I learned something that day. This forest holds secrets. Not ghosts or fairy tales, but something wild and real. Something not meant for us to understand. I keep my eyes open now, even on the quietest trails, and I respect the forest more than ever. It's not just trees and animals out there. It's something older and deeper. Something that reminds me that in these woods, we're visitors and some parts of the wild don't want to be found. That's enough for me to stay safe. That's enough to know when to turn back. And that's what I did. I had been a park ranger for almost 5 years. Most of my work was routine, checking trails, making sure campers follow the rules, helping lost hikers, and sometimes rescuing folks who pushed too far into the wilderness. I was used to the forest. I knew its sounds, its smells, and its moods. But there was one night, a few years ago, that still sticks in my mind. Not because it was supernatural, but because it felt like the woods themselves were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. It was late September, early fall when the air turns crisp and the days get shorter. I was working a solo backcountry patrol in a large national park in the Northern Rockies. The park was huge, with miles of dense forest, steep hills, rocky ridges, and deep, silent lakes. Most of the year, it's peaceful, but at night, it could be unforgiving. My job that day was to hike a long loop trail called Timber Ridge. It was about 15 miles, winding through old-growth forest, past a couple of small alpine lakes, and up to a ridge that gave a view of the valley below. The trail was rarely crowded, especially this late in the season. Most campers had packed up and left before the cold hit. I left the ranger station just before noon, carrying my usual gear, a day pack with first aid supplies, water, some trail food, a headlamp, a map, compass, a handheld radio, and my sidearm, which I never liked to think about but always carried anyway. The radio was important because cell service was spotty or non-existent in these parts. The weather was clear and cool, with a high around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect hiking weather. The trail started in a gentle slope through tall pine and fir trees. The forest floor was covered with dead needles, fallen branches, and thick moss. I was moving steadily, checking trail markers and keeping an eye out for broken branches or signs of people camping in unauthorized spots. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the first alpine lake, a small, crystal-clear body of water nestled between granite outcrops and pine trees. The lake was silent except for a gentle breeze rustling the needles and a few birds calling in the distance. I stopped for a break, sat on a rock near the shore, and drank some water. From the lake, the trail climbed steeply up to the ridge. The trees grew thinner as I gained elevation, and the views opened up to a wide valley below, filled with more forest and distant mountain peaks. I took out my map to confirm my location and check my radio for any messages. Nothing. The sun was getting lower in the sky as I started back down the other side of the ridge. The trail here was narrower and less traveled, cutting through thick bushes and over rocky ground. The forest was quieter. The wind had picked up and the temperature was dropping fast. I kept moving, eager to finish my patrol before dark. The last few miles followed a creek that cut through the forest. The water babbled over rocks, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled the air. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the forest grew dark. I turned on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the shadows in front of me. The light reflected off spider webs hanging between branches and caught the eyes of small animals, deer, rabbits, and squirrels, that froze and then darted away. I checked my watch. It was about 7:30 p.m. I had about 2 miles left to reach my final checkpoint, a small clearing where I could get a weak radio signal to report in. I felt fine, but my body was tired from the long hike and the cold. I decided to slow down and focus on footing because the trail here was uneven with loose rocks and wet leaves that could easily cause a fall. About a half mile before the clearing, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud by the creek. They looked human, about the size of a man's boot. I stopped and looked closer. The prints were deep and recent, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. They were heading upstream, away from the clearing. That was odd. I didn't expect anyone to be out here this late, especially going upstream in the dark. I glanced around. The forest was still and quiet. No voices, no sounds of movement except the creek. I thought about following the prints just to check if someone needed help, but I knew I had to report in soon. I made a quick decision to stick to my route. I put away my map, adjusted my pack, and moved on. A few minutes later, my radio crackled. It was the dispatcher at the ranger station. "Ranger, do you copy?" "Over." I answered. "Copy dispatch. I'm about 2 miles out. No issues so far." "Roger. Weather is dropping fast. Temperatures expected near freezing overnight. Be careful out there." I acknowledged and turned back to the trail. Then I heard it. A twig snapping to my right, just off the trail. I froze. My headlamp scanned the darkness. Nothing. I kept walking, slower now, more alert. The forest felt different, heavier somehow. Another snap, closer this time. I stopped and listened. Silence. I shook my head and kept moving. Then the snapping started again, but this time it was coming from both sides of the trail, like something was moving parallel to me through the bushes. I pulled out my sidearm and shone the headlamp off the trail into the thick underbrush. Still nothing visible. My heart was pounding. I knew the woods were full of animals, deer, coyotes, maybe even a bear, but I hadn't seen or heard anything close enough to cause this much noise. I moved faster, trying to keep calm. Then I heard heavy breathing, low and close, coming from ahead on the trail. I stopped dead. No wind, no animals, just breathing. It was human. I clicked off my headlamp, dropping it to my side. The dark was thick and black. I listened. The breathing was gone. I turned the headlamp back on and swept it slowly along the trail. Still nothing. I swallowed hard and kept walking. The trail curved sharply and opened into the clearing where I planned to check in. I hurried there. The clearing was ringed with tall pines. In the middle stood an old metal fire ring, rusted and cold. I scanned the ground for a campsite, but there was none. I pulled out my radio and called in. "Dispatch, this is Ranger. I'm at the clearing. No sign of anyone here. Over." The reply was quick. "Copy, Ranger. Weather is dropping rapidly. We're sending a team to pick you up. Stay put." I nodded even though they couldn't see me. I settled down near a pine tree and pulled out my emergency blanket and extra jacket from my pack. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind was cold and biting. I tried to relax and keep my mind steady. After about 20 minutes, I heard a faint rustling noise on the edge of the clearing. I looked up, my sidearm ready. The noise grew louder, like footsteps moving around the clearing. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. He was tall, wearing a thick jacket and boots, his face shadowed by a hood. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. No answer. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt my stomach tighten. I tried a radio for backup again, but my radio was dead. The batteries were drained. Panic crept in. The man took a slow step toward me. I took a step back, then another. He was too close now. I raised my sidearm and shouted, "Stop!" The man froze. I saw his face then. He looked exhausted, wild and frightened. No weapon. I lowered my gun slowly. He spoke then, his voice low and urgent. "Please help me." He told me he'd been hiking alone for days, lost, with no food or water, and that he had been following the creek to find the trail. I nodded and told him to stay put while I tried to get my radio working again. The man sat near the fire ring, shivering. I took out my extra water and gave it to him. He drank quickly. I checked my radio again. Still dead. I tried my phone. No signal. I was alone, with a lost stranger, in the middle of a cold forest at night. I made a decision. We needed to move to higher ground, where the trees were thinner and the chance of signal was better. I told him to follow me. We packed up what little we had and started up the ridge. The man stumbled, weak and tired. I helped him. We climbed slowly. The wind was stronger now, colder. Branches cracked underfoot. After about half an hour, I found a small, rocky outcrop. I pulled out my radio and tried again. Static. Then, finally, a faint crackle and a voice. "Ranger, do you read?" "Over." I answered. "We have a lost hiker with me. Request immediate extraction at Timber Ridge Trailhead." "Over." They confirmed. I radioed the lost man's name and condition. Then we sat together, the wind howling around us. The stars were clear and bright overhead. I kept my sidearm close, but the man was quiet now, resting. After what felt like hours, I heard a vehicle engine below. The extraction team. They found us and got the man to safety. The next day, I was back at the station, safe and warm. I thought about that night for a long time. No ghosts, no monsters, just the cold, the dark, and the real danger of being alone in the wilderness. I learned something important that night. The forest doesn't need to be haunted to be scary. It just needs to be wild. And you have to respect that wildness, or it can break you. I was alone out there, deep in the backcountry of the national park, 100 miles from the nearest road. My truck was parked miles back at the ranger station where I'd left it that morning, loaded with all the gear I needed. My job was to check a rarely visited trail that had been reported damaged by a recent storm and to clear any fallen trees blocking the way. I was a park ranger with years of experience, but even after all that time, being out here by myself made me feel small. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. The kind of smell that sinks into your clothes and hair and doesn't leave for days. The sun was high, but mostly blocked by the tall firs and cedars stretching up toward the sky. I had my pack on, with a chainsaw strapped to the side, some water, a first aid kit, and a GPS unit. The trailhead was marked on the map, but out here, maps don't always help as much as you'd think. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, twisted through dense woods and steep hills. Branches scraped my jacket as I moved slowly forward, eyes scanning for any sign of recent damage. Fallen logs lay scattered like giant bones across the path. I had to clear them out one by one. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, just to the wind moving the needles, the occasional call of a distant bird, the steady buzz of the chainsaw breaking the silence as I cut through the wood. By late afternoon, I'd reached a part of the trail that looked worse than expected. A massive pine had snapped about 20 feet up and crashed down, its branches tangled in smaller trees, completely blocking the path. The wood was fresh and smelled sharp, like resin and broken bark. I set to work cutting the biggest limbs free, sweat dripping down my forehead despite the cool weather. The forest was starting to darken as the sun lowered behind a ridge. Shadows crept in among the trees, twisting the shapes of the branches into strange, unfamiliar forms. I knew I needed to get back soon. Rangers don't like being caught out here after dark alone, but the thought of leaving the trail blocked made me push on. I finished clearing the path, stepping carefully over the thick debris, and looked back toward the way I'd come. The forest was still and quiet, like it was holding its breath. Then I noticed something odd. My GPS, which had been steady all day, suddenly lost signal. The screen blinked and went blank. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a glitch, but when I tried turning it back on, nothing happened. I was deep enough in the woods that the satellite connection was spotty sometimes, but I didn't like it. I checked my watch. I had about an hour of daylight left. The sun was dipping fast. I started walking back, trying to keep track of where I was, following the trail carefully. The trees grew thicker here, and the ground was rough with roots and loose rocks. The wind had died down, and a heavy silence settled over everything. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard it, a faint sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the brush. But the noise was uneven, like something scraping against the rocks or the dirt. I stopped and listened. The sound was too deliberate to be just an animal. It was slow and low, like someone or something was dragging something heavy. I called out softly, "Hello," but there was no answer. The woods swallowed my voice. My heart sped up. I knew there was no one else on this trail today. No other hikers, no other rangers. It had to be an animal, or maybe a hunter from a nearby area. Still, I didn't like the feeling it gave me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept walking, but moved slower, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trail curved sharply, and then I saw it, something lying on the ground, half hidden by leaves and branches. I moved closer, squinting. It was a pack, heavy, covered in mud, and scratched up like it had been dragged. Nearby, a boot print in the soft dirt, large, deep, the kind of print a heavy boot or work shoe would leave. Not like a hiker's. Someone had been here recently. I pulled out my radio and tried to call the station. Static. No response. I tried my phone. No signal. The sun was nearly gone. The sky above the trees was fading from orange to deep blue. I felt trapped, alone, and that scraping sound had started again, closer this time. Behind me, just beyond a thick patch of bushes. I turned slowly, saw nothing but shadows. I knew I needed to keep moving toward the station. I couldn't stay out here in the dark with who or whatever had been dragging that pack. The trail got steeper, the ground slippery from recent rain. I slipped once and nearly fell, catching myself on a branch. The cold sweat running down my back wasn't just from the work anymore. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. Complete silence. I paused and looked around, every nerve alert. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Not running, not quick. Just slow footsteps coming from behind me on the trail. I didn't look back. I started walking faster, trying not to run but pushing my legs hard. The footsteps kept pace. My breath came hard and fast now. The sky was almost dark. Ahead, I could just make out the faint glow of the ranger station lights through the trees. I forced myself not to panic, to keep calm, keep moving. As I neared the station, the footsteps stopped. I turned, saw nothing. I rushed inside, locked the door behind me. I called dispatch from the landline. A team was sent out immediately to check the trail and the surrounding area. They found tracks matching the boot prints and a large, freshly dug hole near where I'd found the pack. They never found who or what had been out there with me that day, but the pack belonged to a missing hunter reported several weeks earlier. That night, I stayed in the station, listening to the wind through the cracked windows, knowing I'd been lucky to make it back. I still think about that day, about how silent the forest can be when something's watching you, and how small you really are out here, no matter how much you know. I remember the day clearly. It was early fall, that time when the air starts to lose the heat of summer, but hasn't quite turned cold yet. The forest was alive with the smell of dry leaves, pine needles, and the faint musk of earth. It was a slow morning at the park headquarters, the kind of morning where everything feels still, but you know something is lurking just out of sight. I was on a solo patrol that day. It was part of my job, walking long stretches of trail, checking campsites, making sure no one was lost or hurt. It was quiet work, but that's what I liked about it. It gave me time to think, to feel connected to the land. That morning, I had my usual gear, a map folded inside a weather plastic case, a GPS clipped to my belt, a radio on my shoulder, water bottle, and a small first aid kit. My boots crunched on the dirt path as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail twisted between towering Douglas firs and thick patches of ferns. There were a few scattered campers set up, but most had packed up for the day. I waved to a couple of hikers early on, but didn't stop long enough to chat. The quiet pulled me forward. About 3 hours in, I reached the section known as Raven Ridge. It was a narrow, rocky stretch where the trees thinned and the wind came through in strong gusts. The trail there was less traveled, and signs of wildlife were common. I saw tracks of deer and maybe a mountain lion, though I never wanted to get too close to one of those. The smell of pine sap was heavy, and the sun shone through in jagged beams. As I followed the path, I noticed something odd. The trail ahead was blocked by a fallen tree. It was huge, one of those ancient pines that had finally given up after years of standing tall. The tree lay diagonally across the trail, its branches tangled in the undergrowth. Normally, park staff would have cleared it quickly, but I figured the trail crew might have been busy elsewhere. I radioed in the obstruction and marked the spot on my GPS. It wasn't dangerous. People could probably climb over or around it, but it needed to be taken care of soon. I began to circle around the fallen tree to find the trail again, my boots pushing through damp leaves and loose rocks. The forest felt quiet now, almost too quiet. No ver sang, nos puedes dar tif. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, large and uneven. But as I looked closer, the shape was wrong for any four-legged creature I knew. These were two-legged prints, barefoot or maybe in thin shoes. They were spaced irregularly, like whoever made them was stumbling or walking with purpose. The prints led away from the trail in a thick brush. I pulled out my flashlight, even though the sun was still out, and stepped closer. The ground was soft from recent rain, so the prints were sharp and clear. I followed them slowly, my heart starting to pick up pace. The brush scratched at my jacket and face, but I pushed on, curious and a little uneasy. Whoever had been here wasn't on the trail, which was strange. After about 100 yards, I found something else, a makeshift shelter built against a tree. It was simple, mostly sticks and leaves, but definitely human-made. No sign of fire or food, though. The shelter looked fresh, maybe built in the last day or two. I scanned the area carefully, calling out quietly on the radio to headquarters, but no one answered right away. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound coming from deeper in the trees. It was an animal, not a bark or a growl, but more like heavy breathing. I stopped dead still. The forest around me seemed to lean in, closing the space. I strained my eyes in the dim light and caught a glimpse of movement, something crouching behind a tree. Instinct took over. I stepped back quietly, careful not to make noise. The breathing stopped. The forest returned to silence. I raised the radio, ready to call for backup. Then a sudden rush of wind pushed through the trees, and I heard something crashing through the brush in the opposite direction. I turned fast, shining my flashlight toward the noise. Nothing, just shadows and rustling leaves. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever it was wasn't just lost or camping. I knew that much. The rest of the patrol became a blur of tension. I moved carefully back toward the trail, watching the shadows and listening to every sound. My radio crackled faintly, and finally, the dispatcher answered. I told them about the prints and the shelter, about the strange noises. They promised to send a ranger team out as soon as possible, but they told me to stay safe and keep the trail in sight. By now, the sun was dipping low. The forest darkened fast, and the temperature dropped. I kept my flashlight ready, shining it down the path as I moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig and crunch of leaves made me jump. At one point, I heard a voice, or what sounded like one. A low mumble, barely audible, like someone whispering or talking to themselves. I froze. No words made sense, just broken sounds. I raised my flashlight toward the sound, but the trees swallowed it up. I decided to keep moving toward the ranger station, not stopping until I got back to a place with people. My heart pounded so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. As I neared the edge of the forest, just before the open meadow where the station sat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pile of belongings was left right on the trail. A torn jacket, a small backpack, and a pair of worn shoes. They looked like they belonged to someone who'd been running or hiding for days. The jacket was caked in mud and torn in several places. The backpack was open, with some cans and a half-empty water bottle spilled on the ground. No sign of the person. I scanned the area around the pile, but there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign of where they had gone. It was like the person had vanished into thin air. I radioed the station again, asking for immediate help. The dispatch confirmed that a team was on their way and told me to stay put and wait. I sat down on a log just off the trail, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the darkening woods. Minutes passed like hours. Then I heard again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the shelter I'd found earlier. The forest was pitch black now, except for my flashlight beam. I swung it toward the sound. No one there, but I knew someone was watching me. I stayed completely still, listening. After a long pause, I stood up and started back toward the station. I didn't want to risk staying alone in the dark. The footsteps followed, but whenever I looked back, the trees were empty. When the ranger team finally arrived, I was shaking, my breath short and fast. They searched the area for hours, but no one was found. No prints other than mine, no shelter, no sign of anything unusual except the pile of clothes left on the trail. The whole thing stayed with me for months after. I kept thinking about who that person was, why they were out there alone, and why they disappeared without trace. I checked the records. No reports of missing hikers or campers in that section of the park around that time. No evidence that anyone had survived out there for long. The only thing I knew for sure was that the forest had claimed them. That day taught me how little control we really have in the wild. No matter how much training or gear you have, the forest can swallow you whole without a sound. It's not magic or ghosts, just nature, vast, indifferent, and sometimes terrifying. I still walk that trail sometimes, the fallen trees still blocking the way, the silence heavier than ever. And every time I think about that person, whoever they were, and wonder if they're still out there somewhere, lost to the woods forever. I'm a park ranger in a large wilderness area that doesn't see many visitors. It's mostly forests and mountains, rough country with miles of trails, thick woods, and steep ridges. The kind of place where you can go days without seeing a single person, just nature and quiet. I've worked here for a few seasons now, and I know the land well. I know the trails, the animals, the weather patterns, the trees, and the quiet places where nothing moves but the wind. One late summer week, I was on a solo patrol. It was my routine. I had a long route to cover that took me deep into the backcountry. I drove my truck up to the trailhead early in the morning, packed my gear carefully, and set off with my day pack and radio. The weather was clear, a little warm for the elevation, but the sky was that perfect blue you get before fall sets in. The forest smelled dry and piney, with wildflowers still hanging on near the creeks. I followed the trail that wound through dense fir and spruce. The forest floor was soft underfoot, covered with fallen needles, broken twigs, and the occasional patch of moss. Every so often, I stopped to check the signs, animal tracks, fallen trees, or anything unusual. My job was to make sure the trails were safe, watch for illegal camping or fires, and keep an eye on the wildlife. The first half of the day was peaceful. I heard birds, chickadees, jays, the high-pitched call of a hawk circling overhead. I saw deer tracks in the mud near a small stream, and farther on, the bleached skeleton of squirrel lay next to the path, a reminder of how wild this place really is. I paused often to drink water and eat small snacks, checking my map and compass. There was a weather forecast warning for strong winds later that afternoon, but the air was still. As I climbed higher, the forest began to thin. The trees got smaller and scrubbier, giving way to rocky outcrops and patches of grass. I was approaching a ridge known for its views, a place where you can see the whole valley below and the jagged peaks beyond. It's a popular spot for sunset watchers, though today I was alone. When I reached the ridge, I took a break on a flat rock. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, whipping through my jacket and stirring the loose pine needles. I sat down and pulled out my water bottle, scanning the valley below. The sun was moving low, casting long shadows between the trees. I could see a faint trail winding through the valley floor, a ribbon of brown in the green. That's when I first noticed it, a movement out of the corner of my eye, something large shifting between the trees near the far end of the ridge. I turned slowly, but there was nothing there, just the wind shaking branches. I shrugged it off. Could have been a deer or a bear, both common here. I kept my radio on, but the signal was weak this far out. I stood and started heading down the ridge trail toward camp. The wind was getting stronger now, rattling dry branches and sending loose rocks clattering down the slope. The sky was clouding over, gray and heavy. I glanced back once. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just inside the tree line, but it disappeared when I blinked. I kept moving. The trail narrowed here, rough and uneven, lined with deadfall and loose stone. My boots slipped a few times on the gravel. I kept my hand on my knife, a habit I'd picked up from years in the backcountry. Not because I was scared of bears, more for peace of mind. As I walked, I started hearing something else, a low, rhythmic noise coming from the trees to my right. At first, I thought it was the wind through the branches, but it was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like tapping or maybe knocking. Slow, steady, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. I stopped and turned, staring into the dim woods. There was nothing visible, just shadows and trunks. I called out quietly, "Hello." No reply, just the tapping, growing a little louder, then stopping abruptly. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a woodpecker or a bird drumming on a hollow log. I picked up the pace, wanting to get back to camp before dark. My pack felt heavier, and the wind was biting colder. The clouds thickened, and a faint drizzle began to fall. The trail dipped steeply down the ridge and crossed a narrow creek. The rocks were slick from the rain. I moved carefully. Then I heard it again, the tapping, but this time from behind me. Faster, more urgent. My skin prickled. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the woods. Nothing, just the dark shapes of trees and the dull green of moss-covered rocks. I started to walk faster, my steps crunching on wet leaves. The tapping followed, keeping pace just behind me. I felt eyes on me, though I could see no one. The forest had gone quiet except for that sound, like someone trying to get my attention. I wanted to call the sheriff or my station, but the radio was dead. No signal. By the time I reached the main trail near the ranger station, the tapping stopped. The rain let up, the clouds started breaking, and the forest noises came back. Birds calling, water dripping from leaves. I exhaled hard, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Maybe it was a prank, some hunters out late, or just my mind playing tricks after hours alone. At the station, I checked the cameras we had set up near the trails. Nothing unusual showed on the recordings. No people, no animals big enough to make that noise. Just the wind and the usual forest sounds. I stayed up late that night, sitting by the fire pit outside the station. The woods were dark and quiet, but I kept thinking about that tapping. Whatever it was followed me for miles. Not wild animal sounds, too steady, too deliberate. It was like someone or something wanted me to notice. The next morning, I went back out to the ridge with 2 other rangers. We scoured the area where I'd felt watched. We found nothing but footprints, some from deer, a few small animals, and, oddly, a set of human footprints leading off the trail, partly washed out by rain. No campsites, no trash, no signs of people. But what really caught my eye was a tree about 30 yards from the trail. Its bark had been freshly scratched, deep marks in a pattern that looked almost like letters. I traced the lines with my fingers. Not natural damage, not from animals. Someone had been here recently and left a message. I showed it to the other rangers. We debated what it meant. Was it a warning? A mark left by hunters? Maybe a local who wanted to keep people away? We decided to report it, but the forestry office said it was probably some kids messing around. Still, I didn't feel reassured. That tapping, the feeling of being watched, the strange marks, it all added up to something not right. Over the next weeks, other rangers reported similar experiences in that area. Sounds in the woods that couldn't be explained. Strange marks on trees. And once, a ranger found his gear scattered near a campsite he'd left clean the day before, as if someone had been there when he wasn't looking. We increased patrols, but we never caught anyone. The woods swallowed them up, and the silence returned. I still go back there sometimes. When I do, I watch the trees closely, listen for the tapping, and watch the shadows at the edge of the trail. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know it wasn't friendly. And I know the forest holds its secrets tight. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also wild in ways that no one can tame. Sometimes it's not about what you see, but what you don't see. And sometimes the forest watches back. I was working a solo night shift in the park, the kind that every ranger hates, but someone's got to do. The park was one of those big, wild places with dense forests and long stretches of unlit roads that disappear into the trees. My job was simple: patrol the back roads, check the campsites, keep an eye out for any trouble, and radio and updates every hour. I started the shift just before sunset. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange. The air had that sharp, cool smell you get just before dark, mixed with the heavy scent of pine and damp earth. I drove slowly down the gravel road, the truck's headlights cutting through the growing shadows. The radio crackled softly beside me. I'd done this route dozens of times, but something about night shifts always felt different. The forest looked deeper, almost endless, and sounds that barely registered during the day seemed louder. The crack of a branch, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. It's easy to convince yourself that the forest is watching. Around 9:30 p.m., I stopped at the first campsite to check on the campers. Most of the sites were empty this late in the season, but a few had tents or RVs parked. The one I stopped at was empty, no sign of people. The fire pit was cold, the ground covered with dead leaves. I did a quick walk around, checking for signs of trouble or anything left behind. Nothing. I made a note on my pad and got back in the truck. The roads were narrow, twisting in and out of thick forest. At some points, the trees were so close I could reach out and touch their bark from the window. The silence between the occasional bird calls and wind rustling through the leaves was heavy. I felt it pressing against my skin, making me hyper-aware of every little sound. As I drove deeper into the park, the road started to climb. The forest grew denser and darker. The headlights bounced off twisted roots and low branches hanging over the road. The smell shifted too. The pine gave way to a damp, mossy scent, like the earth had soaked in the night's cold and wouldn't let go. I was about halfway through the route when I heard it. A sharp, sudden noise coming from the woods on my right. It was a loud crack, like a big branch snapping under weight, followed by a rustling. My first thought was an animal, probably a deer or a bear moving through the brush. But there was something else, something different about the sound. It was too deliberate, too close. I slowed the truck to a crawl, peering out into the darkness beyond the road. The forest was thick, almost black except for the yellow beam of my headlights. I caught a glimpse of movement, something large and fast, slipping between the trees, just out of clear view. My heart picked up pace. I pulled over to the side, cutting the engine and sitting still for a moment. The night was quiet again, but the silence felt strange, like it was waiting. My radio was dead silent. No other rangers around. Just me and the dark forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air was colder now, biting against my face. I shined the beam into the woods where I'd seen movement. The trees cast long, jagged shadows. The forest floor was uneven, covered in dead leaves, sticks, and rocks. My boots crunched softly on the gravel beside the road. I scanned left and right, the flashlight cutting through the blackness. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, mixed with the sharp tang of pine needles and moss. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere nearby, maybe a small creek hidden under the undergrowth. I stepped off the road and into the trees, moving carefully. The ground was soft and uneven. Every step kicked up the scent of damp dirt. I kept my flashlight low, looking for anything out of place, broken branches, footprints, anything that might explain the noise. About 20 feet in, I saw it, a big, deep footprint pressed into the soft earth. It wasn't a deer or a bear print. It was too large and had a shape that looked like a heavy boot. Someone had been here recently. My heart pounded louder now. It wasn't just an animal. I looked around, trying to see if there were more prints. I found a trail, a path of heavy boot prints leading deeper into the woods, crossing under trees and over roots. Whoever had been moving through here, maybe hiding or just walking slowly. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was alone, deep in the park at night, and someone was out here with me. I had a choice: follow the prints and see where they led, or get back to the truck and call it in. I grabbed my radio and hit the button, but the only response was static. The forest blocked the signal. If someone was out here, I couldn't call for backup. I decided to follow the trail, keeping the flashlight close to the ground to watch my step. The prints led downhill towards a small creek that wasn't on my map. The sound of running water grew louder, mixing with the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As I got closer to the creek, the trail stopped. The prints faded into the mud near the water's edge. It looked like whoever made them had crossed here and disappeared into the other side of the forest. I crouched down to look closer. The mud was wet and sticky. I saw something half buried, a crumpled piece of paper or cloth. I grabbed it carefully with my gloved hand. It was a torn piece of a map, old and faded, with some markings drawn in black ink. The markings looked like a crude trail leading to a spot deep in the forest, somewhere off any official path. It made no sense why someone would be here at night, with no clear reason. Suddenly, I heard another noise, a distant snap from the other side of the creek, like someone stepping on a branch. I froze, holding my breath. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath too. I tried calling out quietly, but my voice sounded small and weak against the wide, dark woods. No answer. I knew then I was being watched, maybe followed. I didn't want to panic, but my mind raced with all the possibilities. Could be a lost hiker, someone running from the law, or worse, someone who didn't want to be found. I turned back toward the truck, moving carefully but quickly. The forest seemed different now, darker, heavier. Every shadow looked like it moved just before I saw it. When I got back to the road, I saw my truck's headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The truck was parked crooked, half in the ditch. Someone had been here, or tried to use it. I checked inside. Nothing was stolen, no sign of forced entry. But the radio was smashed, its antenna bent and twisted. Someone had deliberately cut off my contact with the outside world. My heart sank. I was truly alone. I sat inside for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. The night felt endless. I thought about calling dispatch on my cell phone, but the signal was weak, barely 1 bar. If I drove back toward the main road, I could probably get a better signal, but that meant moving through the dark forest roads, possibly with whoever had been following me still out there. I decided to stay put until dawn. The forest was dangerous at night, and I wasn't sure what or who was out there. The hours crawled by. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds outside. A distant coyote's howl, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. Every noise put me on edge. Around 4 a.m., just before first light, I heard something moving nearby. Not an animal, heavier, slower steps. Someone was walking along the road, approaching the truck. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy baton from the console, ready to defend myself. The footsteps stopped just outside the beam of my light. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out, voice firm and loud. "Park Ranger, identify yourself." No answer. The footsteps started to move away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't follow. I waited until the sky started to lighten. When the first pale light hit the treetops, I started the truck and slowly drove back to the main ranger station. On the way back, I called in the whole story, describing the footprints, the smashed radio, and the strange noises. Backup arrived quickly and searched the area. They found signs that someone had been camping illegally and moving through the forest, old fire rings, trash, and footprints matching the ones I'd seen. They never found anyone that night. The park was quiet again after that. But for weeks, I kept checking the back roads with another ranger. The feeling of being watched never fully went away. That night taught me how lonely and wild the forest really is, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. The real danger isn't from the forest itself, but from the unknown humans who wander it, hidden in the dark, with no one to see what they do. I keep my radio and truck in good shape now, always ready for the worst. But sometimes, when the night is still and the woods grow silent, I still think about those footsteps just beyond the light. And I know that in the wild, it's not just nature you have to watch for, it's people too. I was halfway through my night shift at the park when I realized just how alone I really was. I'm a park ranger. That means I spend a lot of time alone in the woods, patrolling, checking trails, looking out for hikers or any problems. Usually, the quiet of the forest is a kind of comfort. But that night, it felt different. Heavy, like the woods themselves were watching. The shift started like any other. I arrived at the ranger station just after dusk, when the sun was dipping behind the ridge, turning the sky a deep purple. The air was cool, but not cold, and the wind was still. No clouds. The stars would be out soon, clear and sharp. I loaded my gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, water, snacks. Then I checked the trailhead cameras on my tablet. Nothing unusual. A few hikers had passed through earlier in the day, but they'd all gone out hours ago. I made a note to check the back trails for any late campers. The park was big. Thick woods, rocky hills, a river running through it. Some places were popular, but most trails were quiet, especially at night. I started down the main trail with my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam bounced off trees, catching the bark, the ferns, and the occasional deer tracks pressed into the dirt. The forest smelled like wet earth and pine needles, a scent I always liked. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something odd on the trail. The dirt looked freshly disturbed, like something heavy had dragged across it. I knelt to look closer. The marks were wide and deep, like a large animal had scraped the ground with its claws, or maybe something else had been drug along. There were also patches of disturbed leaves and broken branches on the side. No animal I knew made tracks quite like this. Bears leave claw marks, but these were too long and too messy. I tapped the radio, tried to call in, but the signal was weak out here. The hill blocked most transmissions. I decided to keep moving slowly, watching the ground. As I moved further, the silence grew thicker. No birds, no insects. The usual night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of owls, the crack of twigs, were all gone. I stopped and listened. Only my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. The trail narrowed, twisting between huge old trees. The moon was up now, pale and cold, but the forest still felt like a black hole around me. Then I heard it. A low, wet sound like something dragging or scraping. It came from off the trail just a few yards to my right. I froze. The flashlight beam shone toward the noise, swinging slowly. At first, I saw nothing. Then a flash of movement. Something big, dark, moving fast. It slipped behind a tree before I could get a clear look. My heart hammered, but I stayed calm. This park had wildlife. Mountain lions, bears, deer, but nothing that usually came this close or moved this quietly. I moved cautiously off the trail, tried to get a better angle. The noise stopped. Just the night again. I raised the radio and tried again, louder this time. Still static. I knew I shouldn't be out here alone like this. Standard protocol said stay near the trailhead after dark, but I had to check. Something wasn't right. I turned back to the trail, but then stopped. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. A shoe. A muddy, worn-out sneaker, half buried in dirt and leaves. I picked it up and looked at it closely. Size looked like a man's, maybe late 20s. Not a hiker's shoe. It was covered in scratches and dry blood. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here, and whatever that was moving in the dark wasn't just an animal. I pocketed the shoe and started walking back. That's when the noise came again, this time right behind me. A heavy, scraping sound, slow and deliberate. I turned fast, flashlight swinging. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, eyes sharp. Then I heard a heavy breathing behind me. Not human breathing. Deeper, harsher, like a large animal panting. Close. Too close. I started jogging, then running. The trail was uneven and rocky, but I didn't look back. The sound followed, pacing me, scraping, breathing heavy steps. When I got to a clearing near the ranger station, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Inside, I called dispatch again. This time the radio crackled alive. Base, this is Ranger Mitchell. I found a sneaker, fresh blood. Something's out here with me. Need backup. Copy. Ranger. Backup en route. Hold tight. I grabbed my shotgun from the rack, loaded it, and sat by the window, watching the dark forest edge. Minutes passed, slow and tense. Then I heard a faint tapping on the window. I aimed the shotgun at the glass. Nothing. No one. Just the tapping, again light and quick like fingers. I flinched, then turned on the porch light. The tapping stopped. Outside, nothing. I stayed awake all night, shotgun ready, listening to every sound. Backup arrived just before dawn. They swept the woods, but found no sign of anyone or anything. The sneaker was tested later. It belonged to a man reported missing in a nearby town 2 weeks earlier. I never found out what followed me that night, but I learned something important. Out here, alone in the dark, the forest is full of secrets, some we never want to understand.